Moana. I'm sure he'll visit soon, I said, quickly blinking away the tears that came to my eyes when Clara asked so innocently about Edric coming to visit the orphanage. Neither Clara nor Ella seemed to notice my emotional demeanor, and Clara burst out into cheers. I watched with a smile as they ran off to continue playing. Sophia chuckled behind me. The children really do like him, she said, taking a sip of her tea. I honestly thought that he was just another emotionless drone focused solely on business, but he's really much more than that. It seems that our cookie baking session might have softened him a bit. I nodded thoughtfully, thinking back to the day that we all baked cookies in this very kitchen. Edric had begun that day so coldly and had been so distant from the children, but he eventually warmed up to them as we spent the day together. I realized that day that the alpha billionaire actually did like children, although I wasn't certain if he would ever admit it. Secretly, I wished that he would be so warm toward me at home, despite the termination of our sleeping arrangement. Finally, I was broken free from my thoughts by Sophia once again. She gave me a concerned look as she raised her cup of tea to her lips. "Are you sure you're all right?" she said. "Are you sick?" I shook my head. "No, I'm really fine. Just a little tired today, that's all." I took the last sip of my tea then and stood. "Thank you for the tea. I'm going to play with the children for a while, if that's all right." Sophia nodded and shot me a smile, although I could tell that she didn't entirely believe me when I said that I was fine. Before she could inquire further, however, I returned to the playroom and spent the afternoon with the children. Ella and I, as well as the other children, had a wonderful afternoon that day. We spent the day playing hide-and-seek, having tea parties, and doing arts and crafts, and by the end of the day, Ella had made quite a few friends. She couldn't stop chattering about Clara and all of her other friends for the entire ride home, and continued to chatter all the way up the elevator to the penthouse. When the elevator doors opened and we walked into the dining room, Edric was already home and was sitting at the dining table with a cup of coffee and a stack of what looked like financial reports. "Daddy!" Ella exclaimed when she saw him. She bounced up to him with a surprising amount of energy after having spent the entire day playing. I watched from the doorway as Edric smiled and scooped her up into his lap. "Guess where I went today?" she asked. Edric said, his eyes flickering over to me only momentarily before returning to Ella. "I don't know. Where did you go today?" "Moana took me to the orphanage." There was a moment of silence, and during that moment I thought for sure that Edric was going to say something to indicate dissatisfaction with the fact that I took Ella to the orphanage. While I did tell Selena where I was going, I didn't necessarily ask Edric for permission, and so I braced myself for a scolding. Much to my relief, however, Edric only smiled at Ella. "Did she, now?" Edric asked. "And how was it? Did you make new friends?" Ella replied. "I made lots of friends, and we played games all day. I even made one new best friend named Clara. Look, we made friendship bracelets." Ella held out her tiny wrist to show off her new friendship bracelet that she made with Clara using colorful beads and string. "Oh, wow," Edric replied, feigning fascination with the simple little trinket. "I'm sure you'd like to see Clara again." I couldn't help but smile as I watched Edric with Ella. It was heartwarming to see him being so sweet and kind with Ella, and to see him being so open about her new friends. As far as I was aware, Ella had rarely spent time with other children outside of her training sessions and the occasional family gathering. It was important for any child to have plenty of opportunities to socialize and play with other kids. As I watched Edric and Ella together, however, I noticed that his eyes darted over to me one more time, and they were not nearly as warm and open as they were with Ella. They weren't angry or bitter, but simply rather cold and indifferent. It was both unsettling and painful to see him look at me in such a way after our history together. Meanwhile, Ella only continued to prattle on about the orphanage, entirely oblivious to the energy between myself and her father right now. "Daddy, Clara said that she knows you," she said. Edric's gaze returned to her and warmed instantly. He nodded. "Yes, I know all of the children there. In fact, I went there not long ago with Moana and had a nice time baking cookies." As Edric spoke, his face seemed to soften once again. It seemed as though the cold CEO was actually looking back on the day we spent there fondly, which was surprising, and when he finished speaking, his eyes landed on me once more. I could sense a hint of what almost seemed like melancholic nostalgia behind his gaze, which lingered on mine for a few aching moments before he quickly looked away once more. Could he not look at me for 5 seconds without looking away? "Can I go back to the orphanage, Daddy?" Ella pleaded. "I really want to see my friends again." Suddenly, I had an idea. Maybe the alpha billionaire just needed another nice day out with the children to calm his nerves. "I'm planning on going back next Sunday," I finally chimed in, stepping forward. "Maybe we could all go together." Just then, Edric's entire demeanor changed. He set Ella back on the floor, then pushed his chair back and stood. "That's all right," he said, shuffling his papers together and gathering them along with his coffee. "I'll go on my own time when I'm free. There's no need for all of us to go at once. And besides, you don't need to wait around for me to have a day off in order to go and visit your friends." Ella seemed somewhat satisfied with Edric's response, but I was not. I knew that he wasn't telling the full truth. The Edric who I had come to know on that day that we baked cookies would have gladly taken time off of work to visit the orphanage with his daughter so she would play with her friends. There was another reason why he was refusing to go as a trio with us, and I was entirely certain that reason was me. I watched as he turned on his heel and began walking toward his office. In my mind, I already began to contemplate why he was acting like this with me. Hadn't we ended our sleeping arrangement amicably? Why then was he taking so much care to avoid me, like the plague? All I knew as I fed Ella dinner and got her ready for bed that night was that I had to test the waters and see if it truly was me that he was avoiding, or if it was something else, Moana. When I went to bed that night, I made sure to set my alarm a little earlier than normal. I was so intrigued by Edric's strange behavior that I wanted to test him a little. So I woke up as soon as my alarm went off and made an effort to run into him first thing in the morning, when he would often sit in the dining room or in his study with the door open to look over financial reports. I left my room quietly and noticed that there was a soft light emanating from the dining room already, which meant that Edric was there. Smirking to myself, I walked over to the kitchen. "Good morning," I said as I passed him. "Coffee?" He was silent for a moment before slowly raising his eyes to me from his paperwork, then shook his head. "No, thanks. I've already made my own." I narrowed my eyes as I studied him. There was no coffee on the table in front of him. "Drank it all already?" I asked, gesturing to the empty table. Edric was silent again for another few moments before nodding once again. Was all he said before he promptly gathered his papers and stood, retreating to his study. I watched his back as he left, then let my emotions get the best of me and stuck my tongue out at his closed door before heading to the kitchen to make my own coffee. I went about my usual day with Ella, but that evening, as Ella and I were playing in the living room after dinner, Edric walked past with hardly more than a kiss on the top of his daughter's head before he retreated to his study once again. "Where are you going, Daddy?" Ella called after him. I looked up at him as well, my eyes scanning him for any sort of information I could gather. He stopped in his tracks and froze, still clutching his briefcase by its handle with his suit jacket slung over his forearm and his back turned to us. I could see his hand shifting on the briefcase handle, as though his own daughter asking why he wasn't giving her any attention was an egregious sin. "Daddy?" Ella called again. Finally, Edric turned around, but only halfway. "I have some work to do, Ella," he said. But Ella pushed out her lower lip in a pout, as she often did when she wasn't getting her way. "You just got home. You always play with me when you come home." Edric's eyes flickered over to me for the briefest of moments once more, just as they had in the dining room the day before. "Yes," I said, holding his eye contact. "You just got home. Why don't you rest for a while?" Edric shot me a look that almost seemed as though my words had burned through his very flesh like fire before he spoke. "I'm really sorry, Princess," he said, averting his gaze and looking back at his daughter. "I just have a lot of work to do. I'll play with you tomorrow, all right?" Ella let out a small whimper, but nodded in solemn agreement. "All right. Promise?" "Promise." I couldn't hide my glare as Edric turned around and retreated to his office once more. The fact that he was so unwilling to be around me that he wouldn't even spend 5 minutes with his daughter after work was simply unfair to her. If this went on for much longer, I would have no choice but to confront him about it. He could be as distant with me as he wanted to, but it wasn't right for him to mix Ella up in our drama. In fact, over the next few days, it became increasingly obvious to me that Edric was avoiding me. He never played with Ella in the living room anymore, and always seemed to go out of his way to leave any room that I was in within 5 to 10 minutes of being there. He even began to let Ella into his study to play with him, which was incredibly uncharacteristic considering the fact that he had declared his study a child-free zone, unless it was absolutely necessary for Ella to enter, on my second day of working for him. On the third day, I had begun to have enough of the Alpha CEO's strange behavior. Was I really so awful that he couldn't stand my presence for more than 5 minutes at a time? It was the evening of the third day of this nonsense. Ella and I had just spent the last hour preparing a nice meal. Not just for ourselves, but for Edric to share with us. It was my idea, and was really a bit of a scheme on my part, to test the limits of how far Edric would go to avoid me. Ella was elated to show him all of her hard work when he came home, and had even gone so far as to put on one of her favorite dresses to mark the occasion. She insisted that I dress up as well, so I complied and put on a nice dress and a small amount of makeup. Admittedly, I wanted to look nice as well, and found myself subconsciously putting more effort into my appearance than I had planned. We took special care to set out the table settings, then sat down at the table and waited patiently while quiet music played on the record player in the corner. Not long after we sat down, we heard the elevator doors open with a ding in the foyer. There was a pause as Edric likely hung up his jacket. Then there was the sound of footsteps before his figure emerged in the doorway. He hardly even looked at us. In fact, if it weren't for Ella running over to him, he would have crossed through the dining room without even noticing that we were there. "Surprise, Daddy," Ella said, jumping up from her chair and skipping over to him. She grabbed his hand, then gestured over to the table with her other hand. "Moana and I made you a nice dinner." Edric paused, studying the table silently. "What's all this for?" he asked. Now I stood. Edric's eyes seemed to widen slightly as he took in the appearance of my slim-fitting dress and neatly curled hair, but he quickly hid his look of shock. "We wanted to do something nice for you," I said, walking over to his chair and pulling it out for him. "You've been working so hard and haven't had any time to spend with us." Edric seemed taken aback. "Oh, I don't know," he began, but Ella stopped him by stamping her foot and folding her arms across her chest angrily. "Eat dinner with us," she demanded, exhaling sharply through her nose. "Moana, let me stir the soup and everything." Finally, with a reluctant nod, Edric sat down in his chair. Ella sat next to him, and I sat on the other side. We enjoyed the nice dinner together, but he seemed to be keeping his focus solely on Ella throughout the entire meal. While it hurt me deeply, I was at least happy that he was spending time with Ella. That spell quickly dissipated, however, when he retreated to his study once more, almost as soon as the dinner was over. I put on a smile and helped with the dishes, then put Ella to bed, but I couldn't sleep without talking to him. So I returned to his study after Ella was asleep, still wearing my dinner dress, and knocked on the door, "Moana." I stood outside Edric's study for a few moments, my hand raised to knock, as I bit my lip and wondered if this was the best idea. Would attempting to talk to Edric even accomplish anything? I almost turned around and left, but as I thought of Ella's sad face when her father wouldn't play with her after work simply because of my presence, I mustered up my courage and knocked. "Come in," Edric's muffled voice called after a few moments. I took a deep breath and entered, standing in the doorway. Edric was sitting at his desk and looked up at me with a surprised expression on his face as I opened the door. "Oh, Moana, did you need something?" "I want to talk to you," I said, doing my best to keep my shoulders back and my chin held high for fear of breaking down right in front of him over such a small thing. I really had been so much more emotional than usual lately, But I didn't want to let Edric see me break down over something like this. "Come in then," he said, clearing his throat. I took a few steps in and shut the door behind me, then stood to face him. "Well, what is it?" he asked. I took a deep breath before speaking. "Did I do something wrong?" I asked. Edric furrowed his brow. "What makes you say that?" "You've been avoiding me like the plague ever since we went to the orphanage together," I replied. "I want to know if I did something or said something to upset you. I'm not sure what you're referring to." Edric pushed his chair back a little from his desk and leaned back a bit. "I haven't been avoiding you," I scoffed. "You have certainly been avoiding me," I said, taking a few more steps toward him now. "You can hardly be in the same room with me for more than 5 minutes." "Well, it's not like I need to spend time with you," he replied. "You're my employee. There's no reason for us to be any closer than what is absolutely necessary." "I understand that, but you can't bring Ella into it," I said. "She deserves to spend time with her father. You come home from work and go straight to your office, as though breathing the same air as me is poison. You've even been breaking your own rule of no children in the study by bringing her in here to play whenever I'm around, and if it weren't for her begging tonight, you wouldn't have even eaten the dinner we spent all evening preparing for you. What sort of a message do you think that sends to your daughter?" Now it was Edric who scoffed. Whose idea was dinner anyway? Yours or hers? His voice began to cut like ice, but I tried my best not to let it get to me. "What does that have to do with anything?" I replied, folding my arms across my chest. Edric stood then, the dim amber light of the lamp on his desk, making his tall height appear even taller as his long, thin shadow loomed on the wall behind him. Then he gestured to my dress. "Did you really dress up to have dinner at home with me?" he asked. "Did you really just want to do something nice, or are you trying to push us to cross the line with each other again like we did before? It's like you think you're going to find a connection that simply doesn't exist." I felt my face get hot as he pointed out my appearance, but then found myself confused at his last statement. "A connection that doesn't exist?" I asked. "What do you mean by that?" Edric sighed, seemingly annoyed at this point. "We're entirely different, Moana," he said. "I appreciate your work as a nanny, but that's just it. You're the nanny. You're hardly someone that I should be mingling with unnecessarily." As he spoke, I felt my emotions starting to bubble up to the surface once again, and began to blink a few tears back. I didn't know what to say. I had thought, after our time at the orphanage together, that maybe Edric was starting to see me as more of an equal and not just a lowly servant, undeserving of respect. His arrogance clearly got in the way of that, because he was just as cold and demeaning as before, and it made my chest ache. "Fine," was all I could choke out. "Thank you for clarifying." There was so much more I wanted to say, but I couldn't speak around the lump in my throat. It wouldn't have made a difference anyway. Before Edric could say anything else, although I was certain that he wouldn't have anyway, I spun around and stormed out. Once the door was closed behind me, I took another deep breath and pulled my shoulders back, then made my way toward my bedroom. But as I walked down the hallway, I felt myself begin to falter, and leaned against the wall. A quiet sob escaped my lips. Suddenly, a voice spoke up behind me. "What just went on in there?" I blinked back my tears once again and turned to face Selena, who was standing in the hallway behind me. She was wearing her dressing gown and had her gray hair in a long braid. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, but I had become used to that as being her neutral expression at this point. "It's nothing," I said, straightening myself and smoothing down my skirt. Selena frowned. "I heard raised voices in Edric's study," she insisted. "If it's nothing, then why are you crying in the hallway?" I sighed, lowering my eyes to the floor. "I just keep learning that I will never be an equal to Edric. To him, I'm just the nanny, and I'm undeserving of respect." A slight chuckle came out of Selena's mouth. "What?" I asked, annoyed now at her flippant demeanor along with Edric's. "Do you really expect anyone from the Morgan family to see you as an equal?" she asked. "So his social status would really keep him from treating people with respect? That's simply bizarre," I said. Selena merely shrugged. "You knew the nature of your agreement when you signed the contract to be Ella's nanny. Don't expect anyone from a family so privileged as the Morgans to treat an employee like a friend, or anything else for that matter. I nodded solemnly. She was right. Although it made me immensely sad, the Morgans were an extremely wealthy and powerful werewolf family. It felt silly of me now to think that my relationship with Edric was anything other than pure business to him, despite our history. I'll keep that in mind. Good night, Selena, I said, before opening my bedroom door and stepping inside without another word. That night, I got ready for bed, but found myself unable to sleep after the brutal reality that I had come to understand. It hurt me in ways that I didn't fully understand, and above all else, it made me feel incredibly sad. Even though my sleeping arrangement with Edric and any romantic ties we had had been cut off, there was still a part of me that felt attached to him in some way, and Mina felt it too. Ever since our arrangement ended, she had been quiet and weak, as though his presence before made her stronger. Eventually, I finally fell asleep, but I had too many dreams that night. Moana. I woke up the next morning with a strange feeling in my stomach. My head hurt after being kept up all night from having too many dreams, but as I tried to get out of bed and suddenly felt a wave of unmistakable nausea come over me, I knew that that feeling couldn't have just been from the nightmares. Groaning and holding my tender stomach, I scrambled out of bed and over to the bathroom just before vomiting. When I was finished, I took a deep breath and grabbed the edge of the sink, pulling myself up from where I had been kneeling on the floor in front of the toilet. My face looked pale and I had dark circles under my eyes. "Are you okay, Moana?" a tiny voice suddenly said from the doorway, making me jump. I looked over to see Ella standing there, still in her pajamas. "Yes, love," I said gently as I squeezed some toothpaste onto my toothbrush so I could scrub away the sour taste of vomit in my mouth. "I think I just ate something bad yesterday." Ella stayed there while I brushed my teeth, gripping the hem of her shirt with a concerned look on her face. "Are you going to go to the doctor?" she asked. I spit out the foamy toothpaste in my mouth and shook my head as I watched it go down the drain. "No, I'll be fine." Ella, however, didn't sound convinced. "Whenever I throw up, Daddy and Selena make me go to the doctors for a checkup," she insisted. "I think you should go too." The concern in the little girl's voice was sweet, but it also made me sigh deeply. I had already upset Edric by faking sickness on the night of Ethan's exhibit. I highly doubted that he would believe me if I suddenly went to him again and asked for sick time off after that. He would probably accuse me of lying, especially now that our professional relationship was so distant and strained. But as the feeling of nausea started to bubble up in my stomach again and my head started to spin, I knew that it would be the wisest decision to have a doctor look at me. "Okay," I said, gently guiding Ella away from the bathroom before I inevitably vomited again. "I'll go to the doctor. Go see if Selena has breakfast for you. Okay?" "Okay." Ella sounded uncertain about leaving me, but she complied and skittered off to the kitchen before I hurled into the toilet for the second time that morning. Once that was over, I was certain that there was nothing left in my stomach to throw up. I shakily slipped on a comfortable dress and did my best to fix up my appearance before shuffling out to the living room with my purse in my hand. Edric was sitting at the small, round table with his cup of coffee when I entered the room, and Ella was sitting across from him with her plate of toast and bacon. Edric didn't look up when I entered, as though I was another one of the maids. "See, Daddy," Ella said, her mouth full of toast as she pointed at me. "Moana is sick." Edric glanced up at me over his newspaper and briefly took in my appearance before looking back down. "She's right," I said, my hands shaking as I clutched my purse. "I need to go to the doctor. I hope you don't mind if I take some more sick time today." "Go ahead." Once again, Edric did not look at me. "Thank you," I said. I made my way over to the foyer, but stopped in my tracks when I heard Edric speak again from behind me. "I hope it's real this time." His voice was cold and bitter with a hint of sarcasm behind it. I had already been feeling more emotional than usual lately, and his nasty attitude only made it worse. Without thinking, I spun around to glare at him. "Do you need to be so sarcastic?" I asked, my voice shaking. Edric didn't reply. I had been waiting in the examination room for nearly an hour when the doctor finally came in. He was unapologetic about the long wait, but it was something I was used to at this point as a human in this world dominated by werewolves. "Moana Fowler?" he asked, to which I nodded. "What brings you in today?" "I woke up this morning with a terrible migraine and nausea," I said. "I threw up twice already and have been shaky since then." He typed my symptoms into his laptop, his brow furrowed. "Have you eaten anything bad, do you think?" "I assume it's food poisoning, but I don't recall eating anything suspicious. All of my food is prepared in a very clean environment by people who know what they're doing, and I haven't gone out to eat in a long time." Just then, as I spoke, I felt another wave of nausea come over me. The doctor, seeing this, quickly grabbed a small blue bag specifically meant for situations like this and handed it to me. I threw up into it, although it was mostly bile now that there was nothing in my stomach. "Seen When I was finished, he nodded to himself and stood. "Lay down on the table," he said. I did as I was told, then felt him lift my shirt and begin to palpate around my stomach with his hands. "Did the nurse have you give us a urine sample?" he asked as he pushed gently into various parts of my stomach, each time making me feel even more nauseous. I couldn't speak, so I only nodded. "Is there a chance you could be pregnant?" he asked. I frowned, shaking my head. "No," I replied. "There's no way." "You can sit up now." He pulled my shirt back down over my stomach and slid a hand under my arm to help me sit up. Then he spoke again. "Are you sure? Have you had unprotected sex recently?" "Well, I had sex about a month ago, but just to be safe, I'm going to test your urine for pregnancy," he said, making my eyes go wide. "I'll be back in a minute. I'll get you some medication for the nausea, too." Before I could protest, the doctor left. I couldn't be pregnant. I'd only had sex once in the past month, and it was with Edric. As I came to this realization, my heart rate shot up, making my head spin. No, there was no way I was actually pregnant with Edric Morgan's baby. It was impossible. I hardly remembered our one-night stand from the drugs in my system, but I was certain that both of us were careful. It was highly unlikely that the Alpha CEO was having unprotected sex and risking pregnancy with women he had just met. The doctor returned a few minutes later with a serious look on his face. "Well, Miss Fowler," the doctor said, sitting back down at his desk, "it looks like you are indeed pregnant. The test came back positive." My eyes widened. I shook my head vehemently, not wanting to believe it. "No," I said, "I can't be pregnant. Are you sure? Can I take another test?" The doctor splayed out his hands, his palms facing up, then spoke. "If you want another test, we can send you over to the obstetrics and gynecology department," he said. "Your test came back positive, but false positives aren't unheard of." I nodded vehemently. "Yes, please," I said. There was no way I was pregnant. I didn't want to believe it. Perhaps a second opinion was necessary. Moana. After a visit to the obstetrics and gynecology department, during which they gave me another pregnancy test and performed a comprehensive gynecological exam, the results were in. I was pregnant, and I was 5 weeks along. That timing lined up perfectly with my one-night stand, solidifying the fact that Edric was the father. I took a cab home, my heart racing the entire way. Thankfully, the doctor's anti-nausea medication worked. Otherwise, I would have been retching non-stop from the stress alone. The cab driver pulled up to the curb. I handed him the cash from the back seat, then took a deep breath before getting out and looking up at the tall, looming building where the penthouse sate. As I took the elevator up, my heart started pounding ever faster. I wasn't certain whether or not I should tell Edric. What would he say if he found out? Would I lose my job? Was it better to just go to a clinic and have the baby aborted before it was too late? I couldn't have been more than 6 weeks along. I knew I could end the pregnancy with a simple pill, like a heavy period. I had always loved children, though. The thought of bringing my own baby into the world always excited me, but not like this. I always imagined that I would marry a man who truly loved and cared for me, and we would make the decision to have a baby when we were ready. Up until a couple of months ago when I found him cheating on me, I thought it would be my boyfriend, Sam. But now, could I bring a baby into a world in which its own father might not even want anything to do with it? The elevator seemed to carry me up to the penthouse so slowly. When it finally opened with a ding, I stepped out into the foyer with my heart in my throat. I heard the sound of giggling. "Where's Ella?" Edric's voice said. It didn't sound like its usual cold and distant tone, but rather warm and playful. "Oh, I sure hope Ella isn't hiding behind the curtains." I slowly stepped toward the living room to see Edric stalking around like a cartoon villain, while Ella's tiny feet poked out from beneath the living room curtains, her little giggles floating through the air like the sound of wind chimes. Edric sniffed the air theatrically. He didn't see me. "I think I can smell a little girl hiding around here somewhere, and I'm so hungry. Maybe I'll find her and have a nice feast." As he said feast, Edric whipped the curtains open to reveal Ella, who squealed and tried to run away. Edric caught her and threw her up into the air, blowing raspberries on her belly and making her giggles turn into full-blown laughter. I couldn't help but smile as I watched the cold alpha billionaire play so lovingly with his daughter. If we had our own child, would he treat him or her just as lovingly? After all, as far as Edric was aware, I was still a human. I still wasn't even sure if Mina would ever fully appear, which would mean that I would always appear human, and so would my children. It wasn't until a werewolf's wolf appeared that one could truly be considered a werewolf to begin with. How could I be certain that he would be even remotely open to the concept of having a half-human child? "Moana's home," Ella suddenly said, pointing over Edric's shoulder. Edric froze. He set Ella down so she could run to me, and when he turned around to face me, the smile was gone from his face. Once again, he was the bitter alpha CEO that I had come to know. It was shocking to me how quickly his demeanor changed once he knew that someone else was watching him. "Moana!" Ella shouted as she ran up to me. She threw her arms around my legs and held me tightly as she looked up at me with her head tilted back, her cheeks rosy from playing. "Are you all better now?" Part of me wanted to cry at how sweet Ella and her father were together, and how quickly his love faded when I was in the room. I knew at that moment that he would never willingly be that loving to our own child. "Yes," I lied, forcing a smile and ruffling Ella's hair. "I'm all better." I heard a door click shut and looked up to see that Edric was already gone, locked in his study. I didn't see him for the remainder of the day. That night, after dinner, I began to feel sick again. It felt as though my stomach was rejecting any sort of food that I put in it, as if the very act of eating was also an act of poisoning myself. "Ah," Ella sighed, leaning back in her chair and patting her tummy. "That was so tasty. I love spaghetti." I smiled and stood to clear the dishes away, but as I did, a wave of dizziness came over me. My ears filled with the sound of my own pulse, and suddenly I found myself sitting back in my chair. "Moana?" Ella asked as she jumped up and ran around the table to come to my side. "Are you still sick?" I swallowed and managed a weak nod. "Yes, love," I said. "I'm okay. Just a little sick to my tummy, that's all." Ella didn't seem satisfied with my excuse. Without a word, she scampered off into the kitchen before I could stop her. My ears were still ringing from the wave of nausea, but I could hear her say something to Selena in the kitchen, followed by the sound of pots banging around and the kitchen stove clicking to life. "Ella, what are you doing?" I called. I tried to stand again, but felt the nausea worsen and promptly sat back down. I leaned my forehead on my hand and rubbed the space between my eyebrows as I took several deep breaths, praying that I could just keep my dinner down. I always knew that morning sickness was awful, but no one ever explained to me that morning sickness wasn't just limited to the morning. A few moments later, I opened my eyes to see Ella standing in front of me with a grin on her face. She was holding a glass of steaming milk in her hands and set it down on the table. "Warm milk," she said. "It always makes my tummy feel better." I felt a tear come to my eye at the little girl's sweet nature despite her father's cold demeanor. I took a sip of the milk, which was warm and soothing as it went down my throat, but it didn't stop the tears. "Why are you crying, Moana?" Ella asked, cocking her head. I shook my head and wiped the tear off of my cheek with the back of my hand. "It's nothing," I lied. "Sometimes adults just cry for no reason." "Oh," Ella replied, furrowing her brow. "I've never seen my daddy cry for no reason." I glanced up then to see Selena standing in the kitchen doorway looking at me with a concerned expression on her face as she dried her hands on her apron. Adults are just good at hiding it usually. Selena suddenly interjected before Ella could ask any more questions, which I was grateful for. Go off to bed, Ella. Let Moana rest early tonight. Okay. Ella planted a kiss on my damp cheek before scurrying off to her bedroom. When I heard the door click shut, I looked up again to see Selena still standing there. Although the old woman was often distant herself, I could tell that she was worried about me. I'm all right, I lied. It's just food poisoning. Selena didn't seem to believe me, but before she had the chance to inquire further, I stood and took the glass of milk. Thank you for this, I said. Good night, Selena nodded. Good night. I held my emotions together until I was alone in my room, but as soon as the door clicked shut, the tears started to flow again. Surely I was experiencing heightened emotions from the pregnancy hormones, but it didn't make them feel any less real. I set the glass down and walked over to the balcony, closing my eyes as I felt the fresh breeze blow across my face. It is Edric's baby, Mina's voice suddenly echoed in my head, taking me by surprise. Where had she been earlier when I needed to talk to her? Yes, I replied in my mind, but I don't know if I should keep it. As I said that, Mina seemed to react extremely negatively. I could tell that she wanted the baby just as much as I did. But was bringing a baby into a situation like this really fair? Moana. I woke up in the middle of the night that night with an even greater pain in my stomach than before. The doctor had warned me that the anti-nausea medication might wear off after 12 hours. Somehow, I had managed to fall asleep without needing to take it again. It seemed that Ella's decision to get me a glass of warm milk actually worked as she intended, but not for long. When I woke up, I ran straight to the bathroom to vomit again. When I was finished throwing up, I popped another one of the anti-nausea pills in my mouth and climbed back into bed. My body felt restless, though, so I decided to go to the kitchen to stretch my legs and get a cold glass of water. The penthouse was dark and quiet when I came out of my room. I figured that everyone was soundly asleep, so I tiptoed over to the kitchen and quietly grabbed a glass out of the cabinet before filling it with ice-cold water and beginning to make my way back to my room. It seemed, however, that I was wrong about everyone else being asleep. I heard a sound of an angry voice that made me jump, and when I looked over in the direction of Edric's study, where it came from, I realized that I could see light coming from underneath the door. I'm not going to give you any more than that, his muffled voice shouted from the other side of the door. No, that's enough. How much more could you possibly need? Maybe it was my pregnancy hormones getting the best of me again, but I was incredibly curious about what was going on. Without thinking, I slowly padded over to the door so I could hear what he was saying more clearly. I didn't hear another voice. He must have been on the phone. Yes, I'll send it in the morning, he said. His voice sounded irritated and hoarse. He paused, listening to whatever the other person was saying, then groaned loudly. I heard the sound of what sounded like him slamming his hand down on his desk. This is even more than we agreed on. The deal was that you would get a nice sum of money and I'd buy you an apartment. How have you blown through all of that already? I furrowed my brow. Was he talking about Ella? Who was on the other end of the phone? That's a pathetic excuse, and you know it. You and I both know that you're still squandering it. Christ, Olivia, grow up already. Just then, I heard the sound of the phone hanging up, followed by footsteps stomping toward the door. I quickly jumped away from the door, my heart pounding, just before Edric swung the door open and stepped out into the living room. The light from the study poured out and illuminated the spot where I was standing. What are you doing up? Edric asked bluntly. His eyes looked tired and his hair was a bit disheveled. He was still wearing his business clothes, although his tie was loosened around his neck, and his shirt had the first few buttons undone. Seeing the Alpha CEO like this had an attractive quality to it, and I couldn't stop my mind from flickering back to the last time we almost had sex. Part of me still wanted him now, even after everything. I held up my glass of water. Just thirsty, I said. It wasn't a complete lie, although I knew that he knew that I was eavesdropping when I shouldn't have been. Humph. Edric looked me up and down, which made me even more nervous. How much did you hear? I swallowed. What do you mean? Edric rolled his eyes. I know you were listening, whether it was intentional or not. How much did you hear?" He crossed over to the bar and solemnly grabbed a glass from underneath. I watched as he filled it a third of the way with whiskey. "I heard something about when Ella was born," I admitted. "And something about squandering money, I assume. And the name, Olivia. Well, forget about all of it," he said, swirling the whiskey around in his glass before drinking it all in one gulp. When he was finished, he slammed the glass back down on the bar and seemed to hide a wince on his face from the burn of the alcohol. "It's nothing, and you shouldn't have been snooping. So just pretend you never heard any of it. I don't need you gossiping with the maids like you did when Kelly came to visit." I frowned. "I don't gossip with anyone," I said. "I only asked who Kelly was that day that she came to visit. I can't control what the maids say." Edric merely rolled his eyes and filled his glass again, this time halfway, before walking over to the big armchair and plopping down in it with a sigh. There were several long moments of silence, leaving me standing still in the middle of the living room, unsure of whether he was finished talking to me or not. I watched Edric quietly for these few moments, noticing that he truly did look like he hadn't slept at all. He noticed me looking. "What are you still doing here?" he asked. "I thought you were just thirsty." I shrugged. "You don't look like you've slept," I admitted. "Do you need me to get you anything?" Edric froze as he raised his glass of whiskey to his lips once more. He lowered the glass and pressed his lips into a thin, straight line. His jaw began to clench and unclench, just like it always did when he was thinking heavily. "I only ask out of concern for you," I said. I felt my voice falter as he slowly turned to look at me. "My health is none of your concern, and actually, I was in fact cured of my sleep disorder, so I've been having no trouble sleeping anymore." His voice was sharp. "I thought I already told you this." His words stung. I felt a knot form in my stomach, which triggered another wave of nausea. Without thinking of the implications, I touched my hand to my stomach to soothe myself. Edric saw me do this and narrowed his eyes before I could pull my hand away from my belly. "What are you doing?" he asked, nodding his head toward my hand. I quickly dropped my hand back to my side and turned back toward my room. "It's nothing," I lied. "Just still a little nauseous, that's all, from the food poisoning." Before Edric could say anything, not that he likely would have said anything comforting, if even anything at all, I turned on my heel and stormed off to my room without a second glance over my shoulder. Once I was back in my room, I closed the door behind me and leaned on it, tilting my face up toward the ceiling as I took several deep breaths in an attempt to both calm my nerves and my stomach. My nausea passed, but the pain in my chest didn't. As I crawled back into bed, Edric's harsh words echoed in my mind. I fell asleep that night with a puddle of tears on my pillow. "Moana! Wake up, Moana! Wake up!" I awoke the next morning to the sound of Ella's voice and the feeling of the bed shaking beneath me. The sun was shining blindingly bright through the window, and outside I could hear the sound of the city bustling below. I could hear the sound of distant music. I had completely forgotten, but there was supposed to be an event in the park across the street today, and Ella was excited to go. "Come on!" Ella exclaimed as she jumped up and down excitedly on my bed. "Wake up! Let's go outside!" I groaned, feeling my stomach turn from the bed moving beneath me. If Ella continued her jumping, she would make me throw up. "Give me a minute, Ella," I said, but she wasn't listening. She was too busy jumping and giggling and chattering about getting ice cream at the park. I didn't think before I spoke next, and as soon as I did, I realized how my voice sounded. I felt so nauseous from being jostled around that I didn't consider how I might have come across as being mean. "Ella," I said firmly, "stop jumping on the bed. Right now." Ella suddenly fell silent. Almost as soon as the words escaped my mouth, I knew that I had made a mistake. Without another word, Ella sniffled and quickly jumped off the bed, running from the room before I could stop her. "Ella, honey, I'm sorry," I said, forgetting my nausea as I quickly climbed out of bed and went after her. I walked next door to her room, but when I tried to turn the doorknob, I realized that she had locked herself in. I sighed and knocked on the door. "Ella?" I called. "I'm really sorry for snapping at you. Please come out." Through the door, I heard a sniffle, followed by a muffled, "Go away!" "What's going on?" Selena's voice suddenly said from behind me. I sighed and turned to face the housekeeper. I wasn't feeling well, and I snapped at Ella for jumping on my bed, I admitted. She locked herself in and won't talk to me now. Selena let out a sigh herself. Children can be so fickle sometimes, she replied. She'll get over it. I nodded and went to return to my room to get dressed for the day, but Selena stopped me. Something is going on with you, she said, lowering her voice. I can tell. I frowned and shook my head. I'm just sick with food poisoning, I lied. Ella jumping on the bed made me nauseous. You've only eaten the food I've prepared, and I never prepare spoiled food. Selena's voice was stern, but not entirely cold. I didn't know what to say. She was right about the food. But I couldn't bring myself to admit my pregnancy just yet. If I was being honest, I still wasn't certain if I would tell anyone, as the possibility of aborting the pregnancy was still on the table. I had a snack from a food truck the other day. I lied again. It probably came from there. Selena didn't seem to believe me. She narrowed her eyes and stared at me for a moment, but didn't say anything else. With a nod, she turned on her heel and returned to her work. I let out a sigh of relief before returning to my room to shower and get ready for the day, and to take another anti-nausea pill. Ella wound up coming out of her room not long after I was finished getting ready. I apologized for yelling at her, and she apologized for disturbing my sleep so unceremoniously, and we went on with our day. I even kept my promise of taking her to the park for ice cream. The fresh air actually helped with my nausea, and we spent the entire day outside without realizing it. By the time we came back, it was already dinner time, and after we ate, I sat with Ella on the floor next to the coffee table and helped her with her coloring. At some point, however, I must have fallen asleep without realizing it. I woke up an unknown amount of time later to the feeling of someone watching me. As I cracked my eyes open, I realized that I was laying on the floor. Edric was standing over me with his arms folded across his chest. "Wake up," he said, his voice sounding annoyed. "Why did you fall asleep on the floor? It's hardly appropriate." I groggily pushed myself up onto my palms and started to stand. "I'm so sorry," I said. "Where is Ella?" "I already put her to bed." Edric sounded even more annoyed now and began to walk away before I could apologize again. Suddenly, as I started to stand, I felt another bout of sickness come over me. This time, it presented itself not only in the form of nausea, but in the form of a pounding headache. I felt myself stumble as I tried to get to my feet. I started to fall, but Edric quickly realized what was happening and leaped forward, catching me in his strong arms. I lingered there for a moment, half because I was unable to right myself due to how fast my head was spinning, and half because the warmth of his embrace was too comforting for me to want to tear myself away. My face went red. "I'm sorry," I stammered, attempting to stand again as Edric silently stared down at me with his steely gray eyes. His look of annoyance had changed to one of concern, although I could tell that he was trying to hide it. "I just got a little dizzy." As I tried to stand again, however, the dizziness only returned. I felt myself fall into Edric's arms again, and then I suddenly felt him lift me up, as though I weighed nothing. "Here," he said, walking over to the couch and laying me down. I felt my body relax into the plush pillows, but at the same time, I already missed the feeling of his arms around me. I started to speak and tried to push myself up to a sitting position, but he shushed me and gently pushed me back down. "It's all right, just sleep here." I wasn't sure exactly how long I was asleep. All I knew was that, almost as soon as Edric laid me down on the sofa, I found myself slipping into sleep without fuss for the first time in days. The pregnancy must have been exhausting me more than I expected it to. When I woke up, the living room was dark, illuminated only by the soft glow of the city lights coming in through the window. As I blinked the fogginess out of my eyes, I came to realize that I was lying beneath a warm blanket with a soft pillow under my head. Had Selena or one of the maids come and tucked me in? I slowly sat up and looked around, realizing very quickly that it wasn't Selena or either of the maids that had taken such care to make me comfortable. Because as I looked over at the large armchair across from me, I saw Edric sleeping soundly. Moana. Edric looked so peaceful as he slept in the armchair. His dark hair was illuminated by the soft glow of the city lights coming in through the window, and even from where I was laying on the couch, I could see his chest gently rising and falling. But almost as soon as I woke up, he woke up too. He awoke with a start, his icy gray eyes opening immediately, as though he had never been sleeping to begin with. It really felt as though the only thing keeping him asleep was the fact that I was asleep. As soon as I awoke, it was as if a spell was broken for him, and he was wide awake once more. Our eyes locked for a long moment as he came to his senses. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I didn't mean to wake you." Edric abruptly stood. "Since you seem well enough now, you should go sleep in your own bed. It's hardly appropriate for you to sleep on the couch." I couldn't hide my frown as I sat up and pushed the blanket off of myself, the blanket that Edric had apparently so lovingly tucked me into while I slept. I watched as he turned on his heel and headed toward his own bedroom, but his sudden harsh words had hurt me too much to let him go, and they hurt me even more now that I knew I was carrying his baby. "Why do you have to be so cruel?" I asked, standing. He stopped in his tracks, his back tense as he faced away from me. I continued, "I know that we terminated our agreement, but I don't see why we can't be friendly with each other." Edric was silent for several moments. Finally, he turned to face me. His eyes were narrowed and his jaw was clenched hard. "Friendly?" he said, his voice so low it was almost a growl. "What makes you think that we need to be friendly with each other? Have we not been over this enough times? I don't need to be friendly with my employees. I just need to pay them." I blinked away the tears that began to form in my eyes before Edric saw them. "I think it's reasonable not to be too involved in each other's personal business, but what's not reasonable is for you to treat me like I'm worthless every time you're around me. I'd still like to be friends, you know." Suddenly, Edric spoke in a harsh, quick tone. "If I didn't treat you like that, then I wouldn't be able to control myself around you." I was taken aback by Edric's sudden choice of words. It seemed that he was, too, judging from the way his eyes widened momentarily after he said them. I opened my mouth to ask what he meant, but before I could, he abruptly turned on his heel and disappeared into his bedroom. After he left, I stood motionless in the middle of the living room as I stared at his bedroom door. I wanted to know what he meant, but it was no use now. Finally, I returned to my room that night and fell asleep not with a pain in my stomach, but rather a pain in my heart. The next morning, I awoke slightly later than usual after such a tumultuous night, but it was still early. I slowly sat up in bed and rubbed my eyes, listening to the sound of a summer rain shower pattering against my window, before the blinking notification light on my phone caught my attention. I had a missed call from Ethan. He had left a voicemail. Furrowing my brow, I picked up my phone and opened the voicemail. "Hey, Moana," he said, his sweet and warm voice such a stark contrast from Edric's cold and distant demeanor. "You can say no if you don't want to, or if you think that you know who might get too upset, but I'm going to be free this weekend and was wondering if you'd like to go out for dinner with me. I know a place that would be nice and private, so you wouldn't have to worry about anything. Let me know what you think." The voicemail ended. I felt my face get hot and my heart start to race as I hung up my phone. I hadn't seen Ethan since the night of his exhibit, when Edric and I kissed and nearly slept together in the heat of an argument. And now I was pregnant with Edric's baby. It surely wouldn't be appropriate for me to go out for dinner with Ethan if I ever planned on keeping the baby. At the same time, however, I was incredibly lonely. Terminating my sleeping arrangement with Edric had admittedly left me feeling isolated, and this pregnancy, and the fact that I couldn't confide in anyone about it, only added to that feeling. Right now, more than anything, I felt as though I needed the support of a good friend. As I held my phone in my hand, wondering if I should call Ethan back, there was a sudden knock on the door. "Come in," I called. The door cracked open, and a small, blonde head of hair poked through to look at me. Ella's hair was still messy from sleep, but her eyes were bright and full of excitement. "Are you feeling better today, Moana?" Ella asked. I smiled and nodded, knowing fully well what she was getting at. The event in the park was still going on today, and I had promised her the day before that we would go back for the farmer's market. "Yes," I replied, although my stomach was actually still a little woozy from the morning sickness. "Give me a little bit and we can go to the farmer's market." "Yay!" Ella exclaimed. I watched, stifling a laugh as she spun around and sped off toward her room. Once I was alone again, I crawled out of bed and headed to the bathroom, where I turned on the shower. The hot water washed away all of the negative feelings from the night before, but even as I got dressed, and even as the rain stopped and the sun came out, I couldn't shake Ethan's invitation out of my mind. "I'm ready," Ella said, coming out of her room and doing a twirl. She was wearing an adorable blue and white checkered sundress and sandals, and I couldn't hide my smile. "I'll be ready in a minute," I said. "Go wait by the door and get your sun hat." I watched as Ella skipped off. Then, once she was gone, I gave in to temptation and pulled out my phone. I dialed Ethan, biting my lip as the phone rang. He picked up on the third ring. "I take it you got my voicemail?" he said. "Yes," I replied, glancing over my shoulder as I stood in the middle of my bedroom. Even though I knew Edric would be at work already, I admittedly felt a bit paranoid. I knew that speaking to Ethan was taboo. "Well," he asked, "what do you say, you and me fancy dinner?" At this point, I couldn't help but smile again as Ethan's kind and warm voice washed away all of my worries. "Yeah," I replied. "I think I'd like that." Moana. After I hung up with Ethan, I felt a bit lighter with the prospect of enjoying dinner with a friend. I met Ella out in the foyer after that, and we went over to the farmer's market. "Come on, Moana!" Ella yelled excitedly, pulling on my hand as we crossed the street to the park that was bustling with people. She looked absolutely adorable in her little blue and white checkered sundress and her big, floppy sun hat with the blue ribbon that wiggled when she moved her head. The stone pathway around the park was lined with various vendor stalls as we entered, much of it produce and canned goods, but there were also stalls with soft pretzels, face painting for children, handmade toys and clothing, and more. I had just deposited my first paycheck from Edric and had some money put aside after paying off a large chunk of my student loans. I double-checked before we left the penthouse this time to make sure that I had my wallet in order to avoid a repeat of the theme park. As the morning marched on, Ella and I slowly made our way around to all of the stalls. I bought us both soft pretzels to eat on a bench together, smiling as I watched Ella happily swinging her legs next to me, then took her to get her face painted. After that, we stopped at the stalls with the handmade toys and clothing, where I bought Ella a little handmade stuffed duck. At this stall, there was a rack of women's dresses for sale. Ella reached out her little hands and tugged on one of the dresses. It was a long, flowy dress in a sky blue color. "Moana, this is so pretty," she said, pointing. "You could match me." "I take it that blue is someone's favorite color?" the attendant asked, looking at Ella with a big smile. Ella nodded matter-of-factly. "I love blue." "I'll tell you what," the attendant said, standing and coming over to check the price on the tag before looking at me. "If you want to try it on, I'll give you a 25% discount. I think this color would be lovely on you." "Oh, I don't know," I replied, feeling my face get red. "I don't really have anywhere to wear something like that." "It's just a cotton dress," the attendant chimed in with a wink. "Besides, a pretty girl like you probably goes on plenty of dates with your husband." I didn't feel like correcting the attendant, and between her affectatious smile and Ella's pleading look, I finally agreed. "Okay," I said, to which Ella squealed excitedly. "I'll try it on." The attendant grinned and took the dress off of the rack, then led me over to the back of the tent where there was a curtain in the corner. She pulled the curtain aside to reveal a tiny makeshift dressing room with a standing mirror. "Wait here, Ella," I said, stepping inside and closing the curtain. I sighed once I was inside and held the dress up to myself. It was a pretty color, and the shape was nice. Maybe I could dress it down a bit to wear as an everyday dress, or to go out for lunch on my little crepe dates with Ella. Or perhaps I could wear it to my date with Ethan. I quickly slipped off my own plain dress and slipped on the blue one. My eyes widened as I looked at myself in the mirror. It really was beautiful on me. It reached down to my ankles, and the skirt flowed when I moved, but the waist fit snugly to show off my curves. It had two thin straps that tied on my shoulders with soft, silky ribbons. I stepped out of the dressing room and twirled. "What do you think?" I asked. "Oh, it looks lovely on you," the attendant said as she clasped her hands together. Meanwhile, Ella squealed again in delight. "Will you wear it today?" Ella asked, jumping up and down. "Please, I want a match." I looked down at myself, wondering if I looked out of place with nothing else on but my tote bag, my sandals, and my sun hat, but decided that it was worth it to make Ella happy. When we arrived back at the penthouse, I began to feel ill on the elevator. I hardly made it to the bathroom before I began to retch. When I was finished, I stood and leaned over the sink, taking deep breaths to soothe my nerves as the feeling of nausea lingered and the pounding in my head intensified. Suddenly, I heard someone clear their throat. I jumped and whirled around on my feet to see Selena standing in the doorway. "Oh, good morning, Selena," I said, my voice shaking slightly from the recent vomiting spell in combination with the shock of seeing her standing there. Without speaking, she suddenly walked toward me and brusquely cupped my breast in her hand with her brow furrowed. "Hey!" I shouted, jumping back and smacking her hand away as my face went bright red. "What are you doing?" Selena frowned. "Your breasts are heavy. Are you sure you're not pregnant?" My heart raced. I shook my head vigorously. "I already told you I have food poisoning. Why do you keep fixating on it?" Selena's frown deepened even more, and she narrowed her eyes. "I was a midwife for many years, you know," she said. "I know a pregnant woman when I see one, but if you want to continue to lie to everyone, that's your choice." Without another word, Selena turned on her heel and left my room. I scoffed incredulously at the old woman's forthright attitude. Of course she was correct, but I couldn't bring myself to admit the truth. Especially not now that Edric had been so blatantly cruel to me over the past several days. I still wasn't sure whether I wanted to bring a child into a situation like that, where it would no doubt be treated just as cruelly by its own father, and I didn't want to tell anyone about the pregnancy if I was just going to have an abortion. After rinsing out my mouth with mouthwash, I walked back out to my bedroom and paused in front of the mirror. The blue dress really was beautiful. I turned this way and that in the mirror, admiring how the bodice fit so perfectly and how the skirt twirled when I moved. And then, without thinking, I turned to the side to look at my belly, and I imagined how it would look and feel 8 months from now. I ran my hands over my belly and closed my eyes, imagining the feeling of the little one inside of me. I wondered if it would be a little girl like Ella or a little boy. I wondered if the child would have red hair like me. I had always wanted children, just not like this. But I didn't know if I could bring myself to end the pregnancy. Later that night, after dinner, I put Ella to bed and returned to my room. I took off my dress and hung it in the closet, then walked over to the bathroom to shower and get ready for bed. As I passed the bathroom sink, however, I did a double take and furrowed my brow. Someone, likely Selena, had placed a box of pregnancy tests on the sink. Part of me was somewhat annoyed at the housekeeper's blunt way of doing things, but I couldn't deny the fact that there was another, larger part of me that was moved by her caring nature. Just then, for the first time in days, I felt Mina's presence coming out much more strongly. While I had felt her here and there over the past few days, she had only come and gone briefly with few words, if any. Now she seemed stronger and more able to talk. "It's his baby," she said, matter-of-factly. "Yes," I replied out loud, keeping my voice low. "It's definitely his." "Are you going to keep it?" Mina asked. I paused for a moment, biting my lip thoughtfully before finally answering. I don't know, honestly," I replied. "I want to. I've always wanted a little one of my own, but it's not the best situation to bring a child into." Now, Mina was silent for a moment, but I could feel an ache in my chest, and I couldn't tell if it was more my pain or hers. Maybe both. "I'd like you to keep it," she said, "but I understand that he might not accept the baby or treat it well. Ultimately, it's your decision, I suppose." That, however, was precisely the problem. It was my decision, and the truth was that I didn't know which decision to make. I knew that I couldn't go on hiding this pregnancy forever. Selena already figured it out, and others would soon start to notice my belly growing. "Will you be mad at me if I decide not to keep it?" I asked Mina. She didn't answer. In fact, while I was thinking to myself, I hadn't realized that her presence had faded away at all. I realized one thing, though. I would have to make a decision as soon as possible. Moana. I woke up the next morning, after having stashed the box of unused pregnancy tests in my medicine cabinet, and felt even more sick than the day before. I was sure, as I achingly dragged myself out of bed and turned on the shower, that I would have to either end the pregnancy soon or tell someone about it. I couldn't go on feeling like this every day without some sort of support, and it was only going to get worse over time. The hot shower helped a bit with the nausea, and once I was dressed and took the medicine that the doctor gave me, I walked next door to wake Ella up. "Rise and shine," I said, opening the curtains to let the sunlight in. Ella yawned and stretched, her small hands curled into fists. "I'm still tired." "I know, love, but you have training today," I said. I walked over to the bed and pulled the covers down, causing Ella to shiver and grumble before she finally got up. Soon enough, I had her dressed for training. As we ate breakfast, I couldn't help but notice that Selena's eyes seemed to be fixed on me. I knew that she was expecting some sort of answer regarding the pregnancy tests, but I never took one. I took Ella to training that morning without fuss, where I decided to wait and read a book instead of my usual routine of going to the orphanage due to my upset stomach and lightheadedness. When Ella was finished with her training, I was just relieved to be going home where I could rest for a little bit. When we arrived back at the penthouse, Ella ran off to practice on the piano while I sunk down into the big armchair in the living room with a sigh. My feet felt sore and my head pounded, and it was still only midday. Without realizing it, my eyes eventually closed as I sat in the sun, and I began to nod off. I was awoken at some point, however, by the feeling of someone shaking my shoulder. I groaned quietly as I cracked my eyes open. Selena was standing over me with a concerned look on her face. "I'm sorry," I said, stifling a yawn as I sat up. "I must have nodded off there for a little bit. Where's Ella?" "She's playing in her room," Selena said. Then she lowered her voice so only the two of us could hear. "Did you take a pregnancy test?" I froze for a moment, recalling how I had shoved the box of tests out of sight the night before without taking one, because I already knew that I was pregnant. Even though I was moved by Selena's concern, however, I wasn't ready to disclose that just yet. Yes," I lied, nodding. "I took one. It was negative." Selena narrowed her eyes and pursed her lips. She clearly didn't believe me, and before I could elaborate on my lie to make it more believable, she pulled the unopened box of pregnancy tests out of her apron pocket and waved it in front of my face. "You didn't take a test." I gulped, snatching the box from her hand, and stood. "You went into my room again? And you went through my cupboards this time, no less?" Beyond the issue of the pregnancy, this felt like a privacy violation, and it made me more than a bit uncomfortable. Selena, however, was unfazed. She folded her thin arms across her chest and frowned at me. "Why did you lie to me?" she asked. Her voice was cold and annoyed. "What purpose would you have to avoid simply taking the test, just to be safe?" A knot started to form in my stomach as Selena spoke. I realized then that I couldn't get away with not telling her anymore. If I didn't tell her now, she would certainly figure it out eventually, assuming she already hadn't figured it out. "Fine," I said, throwing my hands up in defeat and lowering my voice. "I already know I'm pregnant." Selena's eyes widened. "Do you know who the father is?" she asked. I paused, wondering if I should reveal that the father was Edric. But even though Selena had given me several reasons over my time working here to trust her, I still couldn't be sure that she wouldn't tell Edric that I was pregnant with his child immediately, so I chose to lie, or at least withhold some of the truth. "Yes," I replied, then thinking for a moment said, "The baby is a werewolf, that's all I'll say." Selena paused, then nodded. I could tell just from looking at the expression on her face that she had an idea as to who the father was, but she seemed to decide not to pry any further. I appreciated that. "Well then," she said with a sigh, "what are you going to do about it?" As I shook my head and thought of the decision I had to make, I suddenly felt tears come to my eyes. "I don't know," I replied tearfully, sinking back down defeatedly into the big plush armchair. "I don't know whether I should keep it or not. I'm afraid that the father won't accept the child as his own." Selina was silent for several moments. She stood as still as a statue, but then, much to my surprise, she reached down and hesitantly pulled me toward her. My eyes widened as she did this, but then I felt myself relax, leaning my forehead against her apron as the tears continued to flow. I felt her hand stroking comfortingly over my hair, which was a stark change from the usual curt nature of the older woman. But then, just as quickly as it began, she stopped and pulled away. "I'll help you hide it for now, but only until next week. Do you understand?" I looked up at Selina, my brow furrowed. She was staring down at me. Her expression had shifted from comforting to serious. I nodded. "Yes, I'll make a decision by then," I responded. Selina nodded. She was silent again for a moment, then opened her mouth to speak, but closed it again and turned on her heel. Without another word, she scurried off. That evening, I began to notice subtle shifts in the housekeeper's actions and demeanor. She stopped what she was doing to come in and help me get Ella ready for dinner, then stayed with us while we ate, her eyes searching my face for any signs of nausea over the smell of the food. The food she prepared was hearty and gave me some strength for the first time since my dinner with Ethan, which was a welcome comfort and something that I was incredibly grateful for. After dinner, Selina even helped me with getting Ella ready for bed. I thanked her profusely before retiring to my room, but not long after, I heard a soft knock on the door. I opened it to find no one there, but when I looked down, there was a tray of warm milk and a few small biscuits on the floor. I couldn't help but smile to myself at the housekeeper's sudden acts of kindness. It felt nice, after having been hiding the pregnancy, to have someone who was on my side and who could help me. It was something that I would always be grateful for, even if I decided not to go through with the pregnancy. Moana. Friday evening came much more quickly than I expected. I was nervous for my dinner with Ethan, more so because of the constant looming threat of Edric finding out and getting upset than anything. I found Selina in the kitchen that morning and decided to tell her about my plans, since we had an understanding between us now, and I knew I could trust her. "Selina," I said, walking up to her, "I hope it's all right if I go out for dinner tonight. Will you be able to check on Ella while I'm gone?" "That's fine," Selina said, not prying about who I would be dining with. She had been much more open toward me since she had learned about the pregnancy, and it was a comfort. "I'll make sure Ella gets to bed, but just be back by 10 o'clock. Don't forget that Ella has training in the morning." I nodded, just relieved to have an upcoming dinner that could possibly take my mind off of the baby for a little while and help me relax. The support of a good friend was all I really needed. I was sure of it. As I emerged from my room wearing my new blue dress with my hair curled and styled and a bit of minimal makeup on, however, I could tell from the wide-eyed look on Edric's face that he was a bit shocked by my appearance. He was still holding his briefcase with his suit jacket slung over his forearm, having just come home from work. For a moment I stared at him with wide eyes, too. His tie was loosened, and the first few buttons of his shirt were undone. He had his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, exposing his veiny forearms, and his hair was a bit tousled. He must have taken a pit stop at his bar before coming home. Admittedly, seeing him like this made me feel aroused, although I couldn't be sure if it was because of the pregnancy hormones or not. "You look." His voice faltered, and he quickly looked away. I knew that he wanted to say more, but he decided not to. "Where are you going?" I felt my face get a little red, and my heart skipped a beat. I had been hoping to leave without seeing him, but I couldn't not tell him anything, and I certainly couldn't tell him that I was having dinner with his brother. "I'm having dinner with a friend," I said. The look on Edric's face seemed to imply that he thought I was going on a date, not just dinner with a friend, but I was just having dinner with a friend. I had decided weeks ago that being anything more than friends with Ethan was not the best idea. "Oh," he said, clearing his throat and brushing past me, returning to his cold and indifferent demeanor once more. "Well, try not to be back too late. Don't forget that Ella has training in the morning." I nodded, averting my gaze, and gathered my purse before taking a deep breath and stepping onto the elevator. Even though Ethan offered to pick me up in front of the penthouse, I decided that it wasn't the best idea for Edric to know who exactly I was going out with. so I walked a few blocks away toward the nearest subway station where Ethan was pulled over, waiting for me. A wide grin spread across Ethan's face as he got out of the car and came around to open my door for me. "You look stunning," he said. "That dress." "Ella actually picked it out," I said with a chuckle as I climbed into the car. His smile widening, Ethan closed the door and climbed back into the driver's seat. The next thing I knew, we were pulling up to a fancy restaurant down by the waterfront. Ethan held his arm out for me to take as we entered. I felt my face get hot and red as I hooked my arm with his, but that shyness turned to astonishment when I saw how beautiful the inside of the restaurant was. And it was empty, too. "Did you?" I began, looking around at the empty restaurant with its high ceilings and large windows overlooking the ocean below. Ethan nodded. "I rented the whole place out, for privacy, of course." A waiter came up to us then and showed us to a table. It was located not inside the restaurant, but rather on an intimate covered balcony on the second floor. "We'll have a bottle of wine to start," Ethan said to the waiter, who nodded and scurried away before I had a chance to protest. How was I supposed to explain to Ethan that I couldn't drink alcohol because I was pregnant with his brother's baby? "So," Ethan said, leaning on the railing of the balcony and looking out over the ocean, "how is everything going? With you-know-who? If you don't mind me asking, of course." I shrugged. "Edric is Edric," I replied, not wanting to get into too much detail. I can't tell sometimes if he hates me or not. "He's always been like that." Ethan lifted his gaze from the ocean to look at me. "Don't let it get to you, though. You're lovely. Whatever issues he has are issues with himself, not you." His kind words made me smile a bit, but also made me feel a bit curious. Ethan and Edric had grown up together, after all. "If you don't mind me asking," I said, "what was it like growing up in the Morgan household?" Ethan chuckled. "Not as painless as one would expect, despite all of the luxuries provided for me," he replied. "You're aware that my mother isn't Verona, correct? Edric is my half-brother." I nodded, averting my gaze. "I've gathered that." Ethan shrugged nonchalantly. "Yeah, I know it seems a bit inappropriate for the offspring of a mistress to be raised in the home, but Verona was a good mother and treated me like her own. She always made sure to tell me that it wasn't my fault that her husband was unfaithful. Edric, on the other hand..." "He never accepted it, did he?" I asked. Ethan shook his head. There was a moment of silence, followed by the waiter returning with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. Ethan gestured for me to sit as the waiter poured our wine and prattled off his spiel about where the wine was from, how long it had been aged, and the flavor notes. When he was finished, he left us alone once more. I was about to mention that I would only be having water to drink when Ethan picked up his glass and raised it for a toast. "A toast to the lovely Moana," he said. "I'm glad to have met you. Here's to not getting scolded by Edric." I chuckled nervously, trying my best to hide the fact that my heart quickened its pace and my nerves raised as I picked up my own glass of water instead, raising that for a toast. "I hope you don't mind if I don't drink tonight, actually," I said. "Oh," Ethan cocked his head. "Is everything all right?" Then, jokingly, "You're not pregnant, are you?" "Moana, you're not pregnant, are you?" I froze at Ethan's words, my eyes wide as I stuttered to come up with a response. I'm not." Ethan, seeing my uncomfortable struggle, lowered his glass and quickly shook his head to dispel the seriousness of the suggestion he had just made. "I'm sorry," he said. "I was only joking. Maybe that wasn't a very appropriate thing to joke about. It's fine if you don't want to drink alcohol tonight." I tried to laugh off Ethan's joke, but it was almost embarrassing how astute that joke actually was, if only he actually knew. Then, quickly, I fumbled in my mind to find the right excuse so as not to raise any more red flags about the reality of the situation. I need to be up early tomorrow to take Ella to her training." Ethan nodded understandingly, but oddly looked a little disappointed at the same time. I watched as he silently took a sip of his wine, then set the glass down. "I hope that's okay," I blurted out. "I suppose I should have said something before you spent the money on a bottle of wine." "No," Ethan assured me. "It's perfectly fine. Although I must admit I was secretly hoping for something." I raised my eyebrows. "Hoping for what?" Nothing could have prepared me for what Ethan said next. "Well, I'm staying at my penthouse downtown for the weekend," he said. "Admittedly, I was hoping to bring you there tonight, but I suppose you can't come since you've got to be up early for Ella tomorrow." I felt a bit taken aback by Ethan's admission, and a little uncomfortable. I had thought that we were just two friends going out for dinner. I never thought for even a moment that he brought me here tonight with the intention of taking me home to his penthouse for the night. I supposed, then, that it was silly of me to ever assume something like that, and it reminded me of how naive I had been on the night of my one-night stand with Edric, when I stupidly took a drink from a strange man. "Ethan," I said, frowning a little, "I thought we were just going out for dinner." Ethan's face went a little red, and he nodded. "Yes, I'm sorry. I guess I was hoping to have a little time to get to know you without Edric looming over us." There were several long moments of palpable silence that hung so thickly in the air that I felt I could cut them with a knife. Just as it was becoming unbearable, the waiter finally returned with 2 plates of food. "Filet mignon for the gentleman," the waiter said, abruptly ending the awkward silence, "and penne alla vodka for the lady." The food smelled delightful, making us both momentarily forget our uncomfortable tension. For the first time in days, I actually wanted to eat. In fact, the food was so tantalizing that as soon as I took the first bite, I knew that this very dish could perhaps become my first pregnancy food obsession. "This is delicious," I said, setting down my fork so as not to eat too fast, and savored the flavor in my mouth. Ethan smiled and took a bite of his steak. For the remainder of the night, we didn't bring up the awkwardness surrounding Ethan's penthouse and actually had a lovely time and many deep chats that made me temporarily forget about the looming issue at hand of the pregnancy. Later that night, after enjoying a lovely dinner together, Ethan took me back to the spot where we initially met just outside the subway station. "I really had a wonderful night," I said. "Thank you for everything." Ethan smiled. "I'm glad. And I really am sorry about that misunderstanding earlier. I know that it was inappropriate of me to assume that you would want to spend the night with me on our first real date. Can I be honest with you?" I nodded. "I think I'm a little jealous that you sleep with Edric every night," he said. "I know it's just to help him sleep, and he's paying you for it, but—" "We actually terminated our agreement," I interrupted, "on the night of the exhibition." Ethan appeared to be taken aback. "I'm sorry. I hope that I didn't somehow cause that." I shook my head. "No, it's all right. It was a weird arrangement anyway, so I'm glad that it's over." I realized as I finished talking that my hand was on my belly. I quickly pulled it away and got out of the car as I pushed the memories of that night after the exhibition out of my head. "Oh," he said, looking a little relieved. I bit my lip, thinking for a moment before speaking again. "Ethan," I said, taking a deep breath, "I really value your friendship. I'd like us to just stay friends, if that's all right." Ethan stared down at his lap for a moment. He looked sad, but finally nodded understandingly after a few moments and shot me a soft smile. "That's all right with me," he said. "Thank you," I said, feeling a little relieved that he wasn't too upset by it, as men often could be when a woman told them that she just wanted to be friends. "I would love to spend more time together, though." Ethan nodded. "Sure. I'll see you soon, okay?" After that, he kissed my hand and I began my walk home. The streets were quiet, filled only by the sound of my heels clicking on the pavement. My belly felt full and satisfied after the wonderful meal, and I felt relaxed after chatting with a good friend, despite the temporary discomfort of Ethan's proposition to return to his penthouse together. As I entered through the lobby of the apartment building and took the elevator up, however, I began to feel mounting anxiety as I wondered if Edric would be awake. I hoped that he wouldn't question me any further about my dinner. If he found out that I secretly went out to dinner with his brother, who he insisted that I stay away from for whatever reason, it would only end in an argument. When I arrived back at the penthouse, everything was dark, except for a single lamp in the living room. I stepped into the room and crossed over to the lamp to shut it off, not realizing that Edric was sitting in the large armchair by the couch until I passed by him. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing already as I locked eyes with the alpha billionaire. There was a whiskey glass in his hand and a hint of sadness behind his steely gray eyes, as his gaze slid over my hair, my face, and eventually down to my new blue dress. His face contained a mixture of pain and attraction. The alcohol made him display his emotions plainly, as opposed to how closed off he had been earlier. "Hello," I said, clearing my throat to break the awkward silence. "You're up late." He didn't answer. With a last look at my dress, he turned on his heel and retreated to his room. Moana. I didn't see Edric the next day, or the day after that, for that matter. When he was not at work, he mostly stayed in his bedroom or in his study, and only spoke in brief words to me in passing. I couldn't help but wonder if he had some idea that I went out with his brother for dinner, although admittedly, I also didn't hear from Ethan at all either. As the days ticked on and Selena's deadline came closer, I still hadn't made a decision over whether to keep the baby or not. I appreciated the housekeeper's kind generosity, but I could tell that her patience was starting to wear thin. If I didn't make a decision soon, I was almost certain that she would say something to Edric. The housekeeper no doubt realized immediately from my insinuations that the baby belonged to Edric, and she was too loyal to the Morgan family not to say anything to him about it. I couldn't help but wonder about something else, too. If I decided to keep the baby, would it also be a good idea to finally tell Edric that I had started showing signs of having my own wolf? Would he be more likely to accept the baby as his own if he knew that it wasn't actually a hybrid? But then again, would that also cause more disappointment for him down the line if the child wound up being wolfless? Mina still hadn't shown any signs of fully emerging anytime soon, so there was no telling as to whether I was always going to be considered a human in everyone's eyes. Despite all of these questions floating around in my head, however, I still had a job to do. I spent the next few days tending to Ella as much as I could, and continued to take the nausea pills that the doctor prescribed me so that I could perform my job duties. If I did decide to keep this baby, I would have to know for certain that I would have enough job stability to at least be able to save up a bit of money in case Edric decided to fire me if he found out. I couldn't be going around taking any more personal time off, upsetting Edric, or shirking my job responsibilities due to nausea. One day, it was particularly rainy outside. I was sitting on the living room floor with Ella and putting together a puzzle with her when I suddenly heard the elevator doors open and looked over my shoulder to see Edric hanging his raincoat and umbrella on the hook by the door. He saw me looking and frowned briefly, his eyes darting away as though he didn't even want to look at me before he came to stand in front of Ella and myself. "What are you doing?" he asked, his question directed at Ella instead of me, which I was getting used to at this point. "A puzzle," Ella replied thoughtfully as she dug through the pile of pieces to find the next piece of the giraffe that we were working on. "It's an African safari." "African safari," I corrected her. "Looks interesting," Edric said. It was strange of him to be socializing with both of us together considering how aloof he had been lately, but I figured that he was ramping up to something, and I realized that my assumptions were correct only a few moments later. "Moana, I'd like to talk to you," he said, turning toward his study. I nodded and climbed to my feet, watching as he stormed off without another word. At that moment, I was certain that I was going to be scolded for something, and I could feel my heart quicken its pace. Had Selena mentioned the pregnancy to him after all? "I'll be right back," I said to the thoroughly distracted Ella, ruffling her hair before following Edric and closing the study door behind me. "What is it?" I asked. "I'm holding a charity gala tomorrow night," Edric replied. "I expect you to be there." I furrowed my brow, taken aback by the alpha billionaire's sudden mention of charity. "A charity gala?" I asked. "What for?" "Contrary to popular belief, I do keep my promises," he said. "It's for the orphanage." Now, I was even more taken aback. I thought back to my last conversation with Sophia, who told me that Edric had been updating her on the process, but I never thought that he would go so far as to host a charity gala for the orphanage's sake. Once my shock had faded enough for me to speak, I finally said, That's really nice of you. Thank you." Edric shrugged. "It looks good for the company." I didn't believe him. I knew that there was a tiny bit of the Alpha CEO deep down that secretly wanted to help people, but I didn't say that. Anyway, he continued, be ready by 6 o'clock. I nodded and excused myself before turning to the door to leave, but just as I placed my hand on the doorknob, Edric called after me one last time. Oh, and by the way, he said, my brother won't be there, so there's no need for you to show off. I froze, my grip tightening on the doorknob. Had Edric realized that I went on a date with Ethan after all? Show off? I said, turning around to face him and feeling my hand curl up into a fist at my side. What's that supposed to mean? Edric scoffed. I saw how you were dressed the other night. You looked far too beautiful that night for someone who was just going out for a simple dinner with a friend. I felt my face get red as Edric called me beautiful. And judging from the surprised look that flashed across his visage, I could tell that even he was a bit surprised by his own choice of words. Anyway, he continued, turning around to face the window, as well as to likely hide his own embarrassment. Dress well tonight, of course, but don't dress too well. And remember, many of the people in attendance are going to be wealthy werewolf socialites, so I expect you to behave accordingly. And as for Ella? I asked, choosing to ignore the fact that he had essentially just told me that I couldn't be trusted to act appropriately in front of wealthy werewolves. Edric turned around to face me once more. She'll be coming too, he said. I cocked my head. I thought you have to keep her from the public eye. Yes, Edric said, waving me away with his hand, but the gala will only have trusted friends and family in attendance, as well as only a few trusted reporters. I'm not worried so long as you keep her occupied. I nodded. Is that all? Edric nodded as well. Yes, you can go now. Without another word, I turned and left the room. I still felt strange around Edric after our last interaction, when he essentially told me that my social class was too lowly for him to treat me with respect, but at the very least he hadn't mentioned the pregnancy. I was relieved to know that Selena had indeed kept her promise to keep my secret, although I wasn't sure for how much longer. Moana. On the morning of the gala, I woke up early with Ella to get ready for the day. She had an appointment with a stylist and hairdresser before the gala. Selena explained to me, after I questioned the reasoning behind this for such a little girl, that it was commonplace for these sorts of events. Even though Ella was not publicly known as Edric's daughter, everyone in attendance at the gala was aware of it, and it was important for public relations for Edric's daughter to look her best, even though she was only 8 years old. It felt a little ridiculous to me for such a young girl to be subjected to hours of having her hair done and being fitted for a perfect dress, but I didn't complain. Once Ella was bathed, we walked out to the dining room for breakfast. Much to my surprise, Edric was sitting there with his plate of food, a coffee, and a newspaper. Good morning, Daddy, Ella said, walking up to him and planting a kiss on his cheek. Good morning, Princess, he replied, not so much as looking in my general direction. Are you excited to get your hair done? Ella sighed and sat down at the table. No, she grumbled as she began to pick at her eggs and sausage with her fork. I hate getting my hair done. It'll be all right, Ella. I chimed in as I sat down next to her and tucked a napkin into the front of her shirt to keep her from getting scrambled eggs on her clothes. It's no different from now. You play with your dolls and do their hair. Except I'm not a doll, Ella said. I'm a real girl. I smiled and, wanting to cheer her up, gently tickled her waist and made her giggle. Well, you look like a doll, I exclaimed. The air became filled with the sweet sound of the little girl's laughter. I glanced up momentarily to see Edric's eyes gazing at me over his newspaper, but he quickly hid his face again. Just then, I turned around to start eating, but that was when the smell of the eggs and sausage hit me. I felt as though I was about to retch. I couldn't keep a gag from coming, which Ella unfortunately saw before I covered my mouth. Are you okay, Moana? She asked. Are you going to puke? I shook my head, my eyes watering. I was still holding my hand over my mouth to steady myself as I breathed deeply through my nose. But, as I did, the smell only worsened, and I gagged again. Selena, who had poked her head out of the kitchen at Ella's mention of vomit, suddenly saw what was happening and rushed over. She took my plate away. I heard some banging around in the kitchen for a few minutes before she re-emerged with a black coffee and plain toast. "Thank you," I whispered. Selina only nodded. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling relieved, but that feeling of tension only returned as I looked up again to see that Edric was now staring daggers at me over his newspaper. Surely he noticed that something was awry, but before I could say anything, he finished his meal and quickly stood. I watched as he planted a kiss on the top of Ella's head, then disappeared without a word. "Are you sure you're okay, Moana?" Ella asked, cocking her little head to the side with a concerned expression on her face. She spoke with her mouth full, giving her the appearance of a funny little chipmunk with her chubby cheeks. I nodded, taking my napkin to wipe a bit of sausage grease off of her lips, then pulled her plate closer to her and tapped the edge of it with my finger. "Eat your breakfast. The stylist will be here soon. Don't you want to go on our walk before she gets here?" Ella, satisfied with my response and excited now over the prospect of our morning walk, wolfed down the rest of her breakfast. I soon felt the positive effects of the black coffee and plain toast on my stomach and felt well enough to go on our walk. When we returned from our walk, the stylist arrived soon afterwards. Once Ella was busy with the stylist, I headed to my room to get some rest before the gala. Not long after I laid down, however, I was startled by a knock on the door. Before I could even answer, the door cracked open and Selina stepped in. I sat up, puzzled, as she walked over to me with something in one hand and a glass of water in the other. "Here," she said, handing me the glass of water and opening her other hand to reveal 2 large pills. "They're vitamins for expecting mothers of werewolves. It should help with the nausea so you don't have any accidents tonight." I hesitantly took the pills, but I trusted Selina, so I popped them in my mouth and swallowed them. "Thank you," I said. "And thank you for what you did at breakfast this morning, too." Selina didn't answer. I watched as she walked over to the door, but just before she left, she hesitated and looked over her shoulder. "I hope you make your decision soon," she said. "Please try not to put it off for too much longer." I bit my lip, then opened my mouth to speak, but she was already gone. I sighed, laying back down on my bed. Instead of resting, I spent the entire afternoon puzzling over what I should do about this baby. That night, I put on a simple but elegant black dress with low heels and a simple silver necklace. I pulled my hair back into a half bun and put on some subtle makeup before walking out of my room. Ella was dressed in an adorable little emerald green dress with matching Mary Jane shoes and a pearl necklace. The stylist had done an excellent job, even going so far as to weave tiny little pearls into Ella's hair. "Moana, you're so pretty," she said, running over to me with a grin on her face when I emerged from my room. "You're like a princess." I smiled and crouched down to her level, pinching her cheek with one hand. "I think you're the only princess here," I said, which made her cheeks turn rosy. Standing, I then took her small hand in mine before we stepped onto the elevator. Edric was already waiting in the car, and as we made our way across the lobby, then stepped out into the warm summer air, I felt almost as if Ella and I were mother and daughter ourselves and began to feel a little emotional over it. I quickly pushed the thought out of my mind and chalked it up to the pregnancy hormones. The driver gave me a polite nod and opened the back door for us. We climbed in, and I noticed that Edric was sitting in the back seat along with us. His cold gray eyes landed briefly on my stomach as we began to drive away, leaving a nervous lump in my throat. "Moana." The drive to the gala was quiet. Ella was too busy fiddling with the beads on her dress to talk much, and Edric made no attempts at holding a conversation with me. I felt self-conscious after the way he looked at my belly when I got in the car. Was I already beginning to show signs of being pregnant, or was it only a coincidence? Eventually, the driver pulled up to the curb outside a large stone building with huge marble columns on the front. Edric told us to wait until the driver came and opened the door, then Ella and I got out first. She held firmly onto my hand as we approached the building, clearly just as nervous as I was. Her nerves only seemed to heighten when we stepped inside, and she realized that there were no other children around. "Moana?" Ella whispered, tugging at my dress while giving big doe eyes. "I don't like it here." "I know, love," I said, pulling her closer. "It's okay, though. We'll stick together all night. Ella nodded. Edric was already being accosted by wealthy werewolf socialites and fellow CEOs, so Ella and I quietly slipped away. We weaved our way through the small crowd. The gala appeared to be fairly private, with only a few journalists milling about and taking photos of people. It was lovely, but I felt out of place as a human. The inside of the building was old and well kept, with tall ceilings, marble floors, and enormous marble columns throughout. The sound of the orchestra playing music echoed through the air, along with the sounds of people's voices. There were rows of tables covered in beautiful meals and hors d'oeuvres, although I couldn't help but wonder if I could even eat any of it without getting sick. Selena had given me that medicine earlier, and it made me feel much better, but I was still traumatized from all of my vomiting spells over the past couple of weeks. Just then, as Ella and I were looking for a quiet place to sit, I felt a tap on my shoulder and turned around to see Sophia standing behind me with a huge smile stretched across her aging face. "Look, Ella," I said, tugging on Ella's hand and breaking her from her trance as she stared at a plate of desserts. "It's Sophia." Ella immediately whipped around, her face lighting up as she saw Sophia. I watched as they hugged, then felt a smile spread across my face as Sophia straightened back up to hug me next. She appeared more vibrant and happy than I'd ever seen her. There was no doubt in my mind that Edric's donations were making her life and the children's lives so much better. Even if he was only doing this to make himself look good in the public eye, I was at least happy to know that she and the children were benefiting from it. "It's lovely to see you," I said, giving Sophia a tight hug. When we pulled away, she was still smiling, but her smile faded as she looked at me. "Are you all right?" she said, still holding me by both arms. "You look a little peaked." I nodded, scrambling to come up with an excuse. I knew that I looked a little haggard from all of my morning sickness. "Yes, I'm fine," I said with a smile. "I had a bout of food poisoning not long ago." Sophia seemed satisfied with this response. She then opened her mouth to say something else, but as she did, I noticed that she looked at my belly in the same way that Edric had in the car. It was impossible for me to be showing already, wasn't it? But then again, I knew next to nothing about werewolf pregnancies. Maybe they showed sooner. After Sophia looked at me like that, I made sure to hold my purse in front of my belly. "It's a lovely gala, isn't it?" I said nervously, just wanting to redirect the center of attention away from myself. "It is," she said, tearing her eyes away from my belly and looking out over the crowd. "Edric really outdid himself." I felt a little bit relieved. "You know, I really am so grateful for all of this," she said to me. If I looked closely enough, I could see what looked like tears beginning to well up in her eyes. With the official start of the foundation, so many children's lives are going to be changed for the better. Sophia's words made me smile. "Is that why you chose this career?" I asked, realizing now that I had never had the chance to talk deeply with Sophia about her goals and passions in life. She nodded vehemently. "Of course. You know, children don't choose to be born. They have no control over their heritage, and often they're at the mercy of their caregivers to see to it that they're taken care of. Not all children have the golden opportunity to grow up in a loving home where they can be well fed and have a promising future, and it's often even harder for human children to find that." She paused, dabbing at her eye with a handkerchief. "I'm sorry," she said. "I just get a little emotional. It breaks my heart to think about how this society can harm helpless children in so many ways, and people just allow it." I reached out, squeezing Sophia's shoulder. "It's okay, Sophia," I said. "Your emotions are what will change the lives of so many children. We need more people like you." Sophia smiled tearfully. Just then the speeches began. Edric stood up on the stage first behind the podium, and for the first time, I had the chance to see his diplomacy in person. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he said, leaning into the microphone a bit. "This past month, I have had the pleasure of getting to know the director of the Oceanside Orphanage." Edric's speech went on for several minutes. I felt almost enthralled by his eloquence as he spoke, and was even moved by some of the kind things that he said about the orphanage. I knew that a lot of it was only fabricated to make his image as a CEO look better, but it still made me wonder if there was indeed a tiny shred of light inside his dark and cold soul. After Edric's speech, Kelly also gave a speech. I was surprised to see her speaking at the gala, and even more surprised when Sophia leaned over and whispered in my ear that Kelly was one of the biggest donors to the foundation so far. Was Kelly secretly a much kinder person than I previously thought, or did she have some sort of ulterior motive? The speeches ended, followed by a champagne toast. I felt a bit uncomfortable, trying to hide the fact that I wasn't drinking. Thankfully, Sophia didn't seem to notice. The orchestra began to play music, and people began to flock to the dance floor in groups of 2. Sophia turned toward me with a smile on her face. "Are you going to?" she began, but stopped as her eyes caught something behind me and her smile widened. "Kelly," she exclaimed, "how nice to see you." "Moana." Just as Sophia was going to ask if I was going to dance, her eyes caught something behind me, and her face lit up. "Kelly," she exclaimed, waving over my shoulder. "How nice to see you." I felt myself tense, as did Ella, who was still holding my hand. I turned around slowly to see Kelly approaching. I hadn't noticed before from where I stood, and because she was standing behind the podium, but her dress was inappropriately tight and low-cut for a charity gala, and she appeared to already be tipsy as she walked up to us. She brushed right past me, as if I wasn't even there, and walked straight up to Sophia. "Thank you so much for your donation," Sophia said, smiling widely and holding her hand out for Kelly to shake. Kelly gave Sophia's hand a half-hearted and almost disgusted squeeze and swirled the bubbly champagne around in her glass. "It's my pleasure," she said. I was still surprised that Kelly, of all people, would donate any money at all to a foundation for human orphanages, but perhaps she really wasn't as bad as I had originally thought. "That's very kind of you," I said. Kelly looked over at me as though I hadn't been standing there at all, and as though she only noticed me when I finally spoke. "Oh, Moana," she said, flicking a strand of blonde hair over her thin shoulder. "I didn't know you were here. You know Sophia?" I nodded, but before I could say anything, Ella suddenly spoke up. "Moana grew up at the orphanage," she exclaimed excitedly, unaware of the implications of revealing something like that. Kelly's eyes immediately narrowed, and as she looked at me, her gaze felt as sharp as a dagger. "Is that so?" Kelly asked. As she looked at me, I sensed a hint of mocking humor behind her icy eyes. "It is," I said, choosing to not let her nasty demeanor take hold of me as I pushed my shoulders back proudly. Sophia was, and still is, an angel for caring for children as much as she does. Kelly paused for a long, uncomfortable moment. "It's funny," she said, licking her lips and taking a sip of her champagne, her eyes still fixed on me over the top of the glass. "I actually didn't know that at all when I originally donated to my close friend's foundation. I supposed that was why she donated so much. If she had known that Oceanside Orphanage was the orphanage that I grew up in, I was certain that she wouldn't have donated anything at all." Then, as though a switch had been flipped, she perked up when she saw Edric walk across the dance floor ahead of us. "Well, I'm going to dance," she said, her voice breathy. "It was a pleasure seeing you both." I watched, unconvinced by her platitudes, as she sauntered over to Edric. They spoke for a minute, then walked over to the dance floor and pressed their bodies together closely. Knowing now that I was carrying Edric's child in my belly, I felt even more jealous than I had on the day that I first met Kelly. But I had to push those feelings down, because as both Edric and Selena said, I was just the nanny. I wasn't a romantic option for him, and I likely never would be. Sophia, however, seemed to have a different opinion of Kelly, one that was likely blinded by her large donation. She said, watching them dance. "They seem to be a good match, don't they?" I felt an ache in my chest at Sophia's words. Suddenly, as though she shared my mind, Ella spoke up again. "No way," she said, folding her arms. "They are not a good match." Even though I agreed with Ella, Sophia and I couldn't help but laugh a bit at the little girl's brutal honesty. Sophia and I eventually parted ways, as Ella continuously insisted on tugging me closer and closer to the dessert table. With a promise to say goodbye before we left, I finally relented and let Ella pick something out to eat, and I couldn't resist getting something for myself, too. As we were looking for a place to sit, we heard a familiar voice calling Ella's name, and looked up to see Verona sitting at a table nearby, beckoning for Ella. Ella squealed excitedly and ran over to her grandmother, leaving me trailing behind with our plates of food. "Hello, darling," Verona said, kissing Ella on both cheeks as I approached. "My, look at your little green dress. You're as cute as a button." She looked up at me then and cast me a warm smile. "Enjoying the gala, Moana?" I nodded, setting Ella's plate down in front of her. Verona gestured for me to take the open chair on the other side of Ella, which I did, and tucked a napkin into the front of Ella's dress to keep her from getting cake icing all over herself. "I would dance," Verona said, "but it seems that my husband is nowhere to be found, and my son already has a dance partner." I glanced over at the dance floor to see Edric and Kelly dancing closely to the rhythm of the music. He had told me before that she was just a friend, but that was always the most common excuse in these sorts of situations with men and women, so I couldn't be fully sure. The way that he gazed down at her gave me a slight pang in my chest, but I ignored it and smiled back at Verona. "Still," she continued, breaking my train of thought, "I like your company, and yours too, little Miss Ella." With a smile, she reached out and pinched Ella's cheek, which was full of cake. I was certain that I would be dealing with a sugar high from the little girl later. The older woman's kind words were a welcome change from her son's coldness at home, but I couldn't stop thinking about what she had just said. It brought me back to the night that he laid me down on the couch, and how he fell asleep in the armchair next to me. After that, he had said that he couldn't control himself around me. I still hadn't gotten an explanation as to what that meant exactly, although I was fairly sure that it was in reference to our lustful history together. I spent the next few minutes sitting with Verona and chatting while Ella enjoyed her cake. It was a welcome distraction from the discomfort of being the only human at the party. My nerves returned, however, when Edric suddenly appeared beside the table. When I looked up, he was staring down at me with those icy gray eyes I had become so familiar with. "Moana," he said, gesturing toward the bar, "should I get you a drink?" I froze. I felt my face get hot as my eyes flickered down to my glass of water. "No, thank you," I replied, hoping that I didn't sound suspicious. "I'm not drinking tonight." "No, Edric." Throughout the gala, I tried not to look too long at the way Moana's body looked in her dress, but there was also something else that caught my eye and held my attention, even while I was busy schmoozing with other wealthy socialites to get donations for the foundation. Her belly, which was always slim with nice curves at the waist, was a little bit rounder. I quickly looked away as her eyes met mine, chalking it up in my head to the simple monthly fluctuations in a woman's body. Besides, if she gained a little weight, maybe it was good for her. As far as I was aware, she had next to no money before she began working for me, so maybe she didn't get enough to eat, and now her body was settling into a healthier weight. Soon, however, I had to push aside these thoughts, as it was time to give my speech. Kelly, who made a generously large donation prior to the gala, made a speech as well, followed by Sophia, who said a few words of gratitude. When the speeches were finished, there was a champagne toast, followed by a dance portion of the event. I stood off to the side, watching as the couples that had come together, many of them married, headed toward the dance floor. I wasn't planning on dancing, but when Kelly scurried up to me with a particular look on her pointed face, I knew what was coming. "I think you owe me a dance after what happened at that family banquet," she said, shooting me a sultry look as she sauntered up to me. "What do you say?" "Ah, no," I said, shaking my head. "I really should be mingling." "Do you think that you'll get any extra donations if you clearly refuse a dance from a lady?" she asked, placing her hands on her hips. I noticed that she was wearing an almost inappropriately tight and low-cut dress and seemed to be wearing a brand new diamond necklace. Kelly had always been the type to obsess over fashion, but as we grew up together, it became more and more obvious to me at events such as these that she was dressing particularly slutty, for lack of a better word, to try and get my attention, even though I told her repeatedly that we could only ever be friends. I sighed, shutting my eyes for a moment, before finally relenting and holding out my arm for her to take. Kelly grinned as we made our way to the dance floor, then pressed her body uncomfortably close to mine when we began to dance. "So," Kelly said, flicking her hair over her shoulder, "you didn't tell me that this orphanage was the same one that your nanny grew up in." I shrugged. "Is there a problem with that?" Kelly scoffed. "No, not at all," she said, her voice sounding overtly melancholy. "It's just—" "She knows the director of the orphanage," I interjected. "It's just business. It's better for PR." "Oh." Kelly glanced over her shoulder at Moana, who was speaking with Sophia. She had a glass of water in her hand, rather than champagne, which I found a bit odd, and also seemed to be doing that thing that she had been doing quite frequently lately, holding her stomach. Kelly, noticing this, looked at me with a sly smirk. "She's gained a little weight, no?" she asked. "What are you feeding her?" Seeing Moana drinking water and holding her belly like that and thinking about her sudden bouts of nausea lately made me wonder already. Meanwhile, Kelly's comment only added to my suspicions. Was Moana pregnant? It couldn't possibly be mine. I was always careful, and we had had our one-night stand over a month ago. Surely it was someone else's. I thought then, back to Moana's secret fling with none other than my own brother. They had been running around together at the night of the family banquet, and possibly even before that, since they apparently knew each other through their volunteer work at the orphanage. Was it his? The dance came to an end, and I couldn't contain my curiosity any further. Kelly made her way across the dance floor to carouse with one of her friends, but I stood there for several moments, still as a statue, as I watched Moana. She was now sitting with my mother. Finally, Moana's eyes met mine, and I straightened my tie before walking over to her. "Ah, there you are," my mother said, reaching out to squeeze my hand as I approached. "I just heard that Sophia, the director from the orphanage, was looking for you." I glanced over the crowd, breaking my gaze from Moana temporarily, to see Sophia lock eyes with me and wave for me to come over. Sighing, I straightened my tie again to go and talk to her. My investigation of Moana's strange behavior would have to be put on hold. I made my way over to Sophia, who beamed at me brightly. "Edric, I really can't thank you enough for what you're doing for the orphanage," she said. "Really, the children are so excited, and they wanted to give you this." She pulled a small envelope out of her purse and handed it to me. Furrowing my brow, I opened the envelope and pulled out a small, handmade card. It was only a single piece of paper folded over with crayon stick figures drawn on it, and on the outside it read, "Thank you, Mr. Morgan," while inside was a series of children's names, all also written in crayon. Some of the letters were backwards, and the warm thank yous were often misspelled. For a moment, I forgot all about my strife with Moana as I looked down at the card and imagined each of the children taking extreme care to write their names and their little messages, and although I would never admit it to anyone, I was touched. I glanced up at Sophia then, who was still beaming at me, but something else caught my eye over her shoulder as I noticed Moana. Her red hair cascaded down her back, and the black dress she wore hugs her curves, although not nearly as perfectly as the sky blue dress she wore the other day at the farmer's market. I blinked, refocusing my eyes on Sophia as I pushed Moana's appearance out of my mind. I couldn't be looking at her like this. It wasn't healthy or professional. "Thank you," I said to Sophia, tucking the card into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. "Enjoy the gala." Finally, after being stopped by a few other potential donors, I made my way back to where my mother sat with Moana. "Can I get either of you a drink?" I asked. My mother shook her head. Moana froze for a moment, her freckled cheeks turning a slight tinge of red before she shook her head and averted her eyes. "No, thank you," she said. "I'm not drinking tonight." I frowned. There was one thing that is almost certain. Moana was pregnant, and it was likely my brother's baby. Did she really think she can hide that from me? Moana. Edric's eyes flashed with recognition as I refused a drink. I knew then that he was on to me. Edric quickly disappeared into the crowd again, leaving me alone with Verona once more. But that interaction alone was enough to cause me such stress that I suddenly felt as though I was going to throw up. "Excuse me," I said, pushing my chair back and standing. "I'll be back in a moment." Before Verona had the chance to respond, I quickly turned on my heel and beelined for the bathroom, holding my hand over my mouth to keep myself from vomiting. Thankfully, the bathroom was empty when I entered, and I barely made it to the toilet before the contents of my stomach poured out. When I was finished throwing up, I flushed the toilet and stood shakily, leaning on the side of the bathroom stall for a moment to steady myself before walking over to the sink. I took a few deep breaths and calmed my nerves before digging into my purse for a mint, then left to get myself some ginger ale to calm my stomach. As I made my way to the bar, I felt weak and shaky, but not entirely from the nausea. Not only did I feel completely out of place at this party as the only human, but I also felt that Edric would potentially discover my pregnancy tonight. And I wasn't ready. I leaned on the bar and asked the bartender for a ginger ale, trying my best to steady my nerves. Just then, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I looked up to see Kelly standing beside me. She looked drunk, but also contemptuously devious. "Just a ginger ale?" she asked. I nodded. A smirk spread across her face. She glanced over her shoulder toward where Edric was standing, then back at me and looked me up and down. "You know," she said, leaning closer to me, "from girl to girl, that dress isn't fooling anybody." I frowned, taking a step back, and looked down at myself. I thought I looked perfectly fine. "What are you talking about?" I asked. Kelly scoffed. "Let me be blunt. I know you probably grew up being half-starved, so maybe you have some issues when it comes to controlling your appetite, but maybe lay off the fancy foods for a bit. Your belly is looking a little—" She stopped then and gestured with her hand around her stomach in an arching motion to indicate a round belly. My jaw dropped at Kelly's rude words. "That's a nasty thing to say," I replied, narrowing my eyes. Kelly simply shrugged and picked up her fresh drink off of the bar. "I'm just telling the truth," she said, before turning on her heel and sauntering off into the crowd. I felt tears coming to my eyes, but I blinked them away. Once I had my ginger ale in my hand, I returned to Ella, who gave me a worried look as I sat down. So did Verona. "Are you all right, dear?" Verona asked, eyeing my ginger ale. I nodded. "Yes, just a little too much sugar in that cake for my stomach to handle right now," I lied. "I'm okay, though." Ella leaned over to me, cupping her hands over her mouth. "Next time, I'll eat your cake instead," she whispered. Verona, overhearing this, threw her head back and laughed loudly. I couldn't help but laugh either. Soon enough, the gala ended and it was time to go home. I said my goodbyes to Verona and Sophia, ignoring the cold look from Kelly as I got into the car and watched as the building faded away in the distance. I looked over at Edric, who was sitting across from me. He was staring out the window. "That was a nice gala," I said, wanting to ease some of the tension. We hadn't said more than 2 words to each other since he asked if I would drink alcohol. Was all he said. "Your speech was lovely as well," I continued. "You spoke very eloquently. It was nice to hear you speak so affectionately about the orphanage." Edric's eyes flickered over to me, and they were cold and bitter. He began to clench and unclench his jaw repeatedly, as he often did when he was angry. It made my heart race. There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Ella seemed to notice this, and apparently decided to take it upon herself to lighten the mood. "Daddy," she said, swinging her legs from her car seat, "Grandma taught me a new joke tonight. Can I tell you?" "Sure. Okay, knock knock. Who's there?" "Orange." "Orange who? Orange, you glad to see me?" I chuckled at Ella's pun, but Edric only exhaled sharply through his nose and returned to staring silently out the window. Ella looked over at me with a puzzled expression on her face. I reached out and squeezed her hand. "I liked your joke," I said. "You're very funny." By the time we arrived back at the penthouse, despite Ella's sugar consumption, she was already fast asleep. Edric carried her onto the elevator, and when the doors slid open at the top, Selena was waiting for us in the foyer. "How was the gala?" she asked quietly as she took Edric's suit jacket. "It was lovely," I began, but I was quickly interrupted by Edric suddenly spinning around to face me. "Did you have something important to tell me tonight?" he asked, rather brusquely. I felt my heart leap into my throat. Ella still slept on his shoulder, which normally would have been a welcome relief, but now I wished she was awake more than ever, because if she was awake, perhaps Edric wouldn't have asked a question like that so suddenly and openly. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing would come out. From behind him, Selena stared at me with wide eyes, slowly shaking her head. No," I replied, swallowing the lump in my throat. Why? Humph, Edric muttered. Before anyone could say anything else, he turned around and marched off to Ella's room. Once he was gone, I felt my body relax almost entirely, and now I felt even more exhausted than before. Go on, Selena said, noticing my exhaustion. I'll bring you some more medicine in a little bit. Thank you, I whispered, then scurried off to my room. Once I was alone again, I drew in a shaky breath. Surely Edric knew about the pregnancy. Even Kelly had mentioned that my belly looked bigger, and I was certain that Edric had noticed all of the other signs. Would I be without a job tomorrow? There was no use in puzzling over these issues because what was done was done. I tried my best to push the anxiety away as I changed out of my dress and into my pajamas. I washed my face with cold water in the bathroom sink and brushed my teeth, wishing that things could just be different. Not long after I climbed into bed, I heard a soft knock on the door. Come in, I called. Selena shuffled in. She had an entire bottle of pills in her hand this time, and poured 2 out into her hand as she approached. I noticed that the bottle had a logo of a wolf's head on it, and it seemed to be a multivitamin specifically for pregnant women. Here, she said, these should help with your symptoms. They're stronger than the others I gave you. Thank you, I replied. I popped the pills into my mouth and washed them down with a gulp of water while Selena watched. I think you need to make a decision by tomorrow, she said, shooting me a knowing look before turning and making her way back toward the door, the bottle of pills still in her hand. If you're going to keep it, you need to start making doctor's visits. The pregnancy will be very hard on you as a human carrying a little werewolf. I nodded somberly, then watched as Selena quietly slipped out of my room. As I laid back on the bed, I felt more tears come to my eyes before I began to drift off to sleep. I hadn't been asleep for long. However, when I was suddenly alerted by the sound of my door opening abruptly, Edric. I put Ella to bed myself that night. It was calming to see how peacefully she slept. If only I could have slept like that. As I returned to my room, still fuming over whether Moana was lying to me or not, I felt as though my daughter's nanny was being suspicious. I couldn't shake the feeling that Moana was pregnant with my brother's baby. I knew that she went out for dinner with him the other night and had seen him multiple times before that. For all I knew, she only ever accepted the job with me to try to climb the social classes, and now she had gotten herself knocked up by my brother. I wanted to believe that I was wrong, that she really was just sick and gaining a little weight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on behind the scenes. For quite a while, I tossed and turned in bed. Finally, I gave up on sleep altogether and decided to get myself a drink from the minibar. I grumbled to myself, feeling rather a lot like a grumpy old man with insomnia, as I climbed out of bed and headed out of my room. The living room was peaceful and quiet when I walked in. Surely everyone else was already asleep. The only sounds I could hear were the sounds of the city outside, and the only light that illuminated the room was the soft glow of the city lights coming in through the big open window. I sighed as I poured myself a glass of whiskey, then walked over to the double doors leading out onto the balcony and swung them open. I stood out there for a few minutes, drinking my whiskey as I leaned on the railing and looked down at the city below. As I stood on the balcony and looked down at the city, all I could think about was how suspicious Moana's behavior had been recently. She'd been sick with food poisoning now for far longer than the 3 to 5 days that food poisoning would typically last. The smell of eggs and sausage made her gag. She was constantly touching her stomach, and I couldn't forget that night that she fell asleep on the living room floor. I would never admit it, but that night was the first night since we terminated our sleeping agreement that I actually got a little sleep without having to take sleeping pills or drink too much alcohol. Speaking of alcohol, my glass of whiskey was already empty. I sighed and turned around to go and pour myself another glass. But just as I did, I caught a glimpse of Selena sneaking out of Moana's room, and she was holding something in her hand. "Selena," I called from where I stood in the balcony doorway. She froze. I could see her slip whatever she was holding into her apron pocket, and I frowned. "What are you doing?" "I was just checking on Moana," Selena said. "She's been sick." My frown deepened. I approached Selina, and as I did, I could tell that she was hiding something from me. Were my own loyal servants, who had worked for me for years, hiding something so important from me? "Did you give her medicine?" I asked. Selina nodded. She still had her hand in her apron pocket, as though that would stop me from noticing, but she saw me looking and took her hand out. "Show me what you gave her, please," I said quietly. Selina hesitated for a moment. I had never seen the housekeeper so nervous before. Normally, she was as cool as a cucumber. "Selina?" I insisted. "Come on." Finally, she let out a deep sigh and pulled the object out of her pocket. It was a bottle of pills. I took the pills from her hand and turned it over in my palm, taking in a sharp breath when I read the label. They were pregnancy vitamins. "I knew it," I said, holding the bottle up. "Why does it seem that everyone in my house wants to keep things from me?" Seeing the bottle made me begin to fume even more than I already was. I had asked Moana if she had anything important to tell me, and she had said that there was nothing. I wanted to trust her. I really did. I was going to give her the benefit of the doubt, and I was even going to offer to pay for a doctor's visit in the morning to sort out what was happening with her stomach, since she'd seemed so haggard lately. And yet, all along, both my nanny and my loyal housekeeper had been keeping something much more important from me. "Don't be mad at her," Selina said, reaching out and touching the arm that was holding the bottle of pills. I didn't realize it at the time, but I had already become so angry that my hand was shaking. "She's going through a lot right now. Give her time." "This is important, Selina," I said, speaking through my teeth. "How long have you known?" Selina shook her head. Her hand was still gripping my arm. "Only less than a week," she said. "She just found out herself. She told me she was going to make a decision about what to do by the end of this week." "So you've known for several days now, and you couldn't be bothered to mention it to me?" I snarled. "I'm her employer. Her performance with my daughter has been slipping, and I think that I deserve to know why earlier." Selina sighed, shutting her eyes for a moment, then opened them again and looked at me with a serious expression on her face. "I promised I wouldn't say anything until the end of the week," she said, her voice low. "Telling on her would have only caused more upset for her." "Do either of you know who the father is?" I asked. My mind went back once again to all of the times that Moana spent private time with Ethan. How was I to know that, on the night of the family banquet, they might have had sex when no one else was around? Is it some sort of plan of hers to ensure her future in the Morgan family? Is she really was just like Ella's mother, a scheming woman with no regard for anyone except herself? By doing this, she was hurting my daughter. "I don't know," she said. "She didn't say. She only mentioned that the baby will be a werewolf." I froze. So, my suspicions were solidified. Moana had, most definitely, intentionally gotten herself knocked up by my brother so she could use the baby to enjoy the finer things in life for herself. That must have been why she secretly went out for dinner with him the other night. Did he really think that he could rent out an entire restaurant for his date with my daughter's nanny, and I wouldn't notice? Did he even know about the pregnancy yet? I had to confront her right now. I brushed past Selina and began to storm toward Moana's door. "Wait," Selina called, running after me. "She's sleeping now. It can wait until morning." Selina grabbed my arm again, but I tore away from her and closed the distance between myself and Moana's room. The bottle of pills was still in my hand as I grabbed the doorknob and flung the door open. Moana, I had just begun to drift off to sleep. Somehow I had made it through the gala, and Edric hadn't pried about the pregnancy. Maybe he didn't actually realize it after all. Maybe it was just my nerves getting to me, and the Edric I saw that night was only him being his usual abrasive and cold self. As I began to fade off into sleep, the tears on my cheek drying, I felt much more at peace. I would still have to make a decision soon, but at least I could do it in my own time. Oh, how wrong I was. I must not have been asleep for more than 10 minutes at the most when I was suddenly startled awake by the sound of my door flinging open. I gasped and sat up in bed, my eyes wide and still full of tears from before, and my heart racing as my fight-or-flight response kicked in, to see Edric standing in my doorway. "Edric," I said, clutching my chest with my hand as my heart pounded. "What are you doing in my room like this?" He stormed toward my bed. Selena came rushing in after him, but it was too late. He was already holding the bottle of pregnancy vitamins in front of my face. "If you have something to tell me, now is the time to do it," he growled. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The lump in my throat was too large, and I felt cornered and helpless. When I looked up at Edric, his eyes were glowing slightly. He was breathing heavily through his nose, while his free hand was placed firmly on his hip. The hand that was holding the bottle of pills was trembling slightly, creating a soft, rattling sound from the pills moving inside. I don't. Go on," Edric snarled, shaking the bottle again. His eyes burned with fury as he stared intently at me, as though doing so would make me feel even remotely comfortable enough to tell him the truth about the pregnancy. Now, more than ever, I just wanted to abort the pregnancy and be done with it. How could I bring a child into a world where his or her own father treated me like this? He was being erratic and frightening, barging into my room like this in the middle of the night. He smelled like whiskey, too. "Have you been drinking again?" I asked, scooting away from him on the bed. "Oh, don't try to twist it around on me," he replied. "Just tell me what it is you've been hiding. I think I have the right to know as your employer, especially when it affects your ability to do your goddamn job." "Edric, leave her alone," Selena insisted. She came over to him and tried to take the bottle of pills from him, but he wrenched his arm away and only fumed even harder. "I'm giving you a chance here, Moana," he said through his teeth. As he spoke, I could see that his fangs were showing slightly from his anger, and it made my heart race faster than I ever thought it could. I felt like a frightened rabbit in front of the big, bad wolf. Where was Mina when I needed her? I still couldn't answer. Finally, Edric seemed to become too impatient to wait for my response, because he threw the bottle of pills down on my bed and glared at me with an intensity that I had never seen before. "Fine, then," he snarled, curling up his fists into balls. "If you don't want to tell me the truth, and you want to sit here and lie to me after I've given you a home and a decent salary, then you can leave. I want you gone within the month." My eyes widened. I felt a pang in my stomach, and it made me want to vomit. I was pregnant with his baby, and yet here he was, accosting me in the middle of the night and telling me to get out. He was sending me back to the streets, where I would certainly become homeless and would potentially even lose the baby. "Why?" I asked, crawling out from underneath my blankets and standing too quickly. As I stood, I suddenly felt lightheaded. Selena, seeing this, rushed over to me and held my arm to steady me. I sunk back down to sit on the edge of the bed, and when my eyes refocused, I looked up to see Edric still standing there with fury written across his face. "Why are you doing this?" I asked again. My voice was soft and meek and quivered slightly from the tears that threatened to come out. Edric sneered. "I know you've been hiding a pregnancy," he said. "A little werewolf, Tell me, was this your scheme all along? A way to get money or climb the social ranks? A way to go from a lowly human orphan who can't even get a job to a woman of high standing with a werewolf child?" I wanted to tell him that I wasn't even a human, that I had already shown signs of my own wolf emerging, but I didn't. I couldn't. Before I could say anything, he continued. "See if the father will accept the baby," he said, his voice low and sinister. "You might think he's someone who would, but I can guarantee he won't. I told you that he's not who you think he is, but you didn't listen. No, you went and got yourself knocked up with his child, and he's going to laugh you back out into the streets when you try to go to him and ask for a place to stay." I frowned then. Who was he referring to? Was it Ethan? "Edric," I said. "Who do you think the father is?" Edric let out a short, sharp breath that sounded like a laugh. "Who else would it be if not Ethan?" he snarled. I went silent for a moment, sat puzzling over how he had come to that conclusion. Ethan and I were just friends. Hadn't I made that clear to him? Aside from the brief moment at the family banquet that there was a bit of chemistry between us, I had never once thought about going so far as to sleep with Edric's own brother. I wasn't a cheap whore who would do something like that. I opened my mouth to tell Edric that I had never slept with his brother, but before it could come out, He continued. "Now," he said, "like I told you, you have until the end of the month to get your things and get out. I don't want to see you anymore, hear from you anymore, and I especially don't want you hanging around my doll." "It's your baby," I finally blurted out, surprising even myself from my sudden outburst. My eyes widened as I looked back at Edric, who took a staggering step backwards. Beside me, Selina whispered something to herself and took a deep breath, clutching the bedpost at the foot of my bed. The room, which had just been full of anger, was now filled with nothing but shocked, disbelieving silence from Selina, Edric, and even myself.